Now, what might that be? I've been in jail longer than Nelson Mandela, so maybe you want me to run for president.
We have achieved our position through poise, precision, and audacity.
He spent 30 years defending a country that forgot his name. 30 years of black ops missions, classified casualties, and families left behind with nothing but silence and a folded flag. And by the time he finally breaks, when he realizes the only way to make his government listen is to threaten 70,000 civilians, it's too late to ask the question that matters. Whose side is the government actually on? This is not a review about an action movie. This is a story about what happens when institutional betrayal metastasizes into something unforgivable. About a decorated general named Francis Hummel who loves his country so desperately that losing faith in it becomes an act of war. And about the one man, a ghost from a forgotten past, who understands exactly why Hummel had to do this, and why stopping him might be the cruelest thing anyone could ask. The Rock doesn't work because of the explosions. It works because Sean Connery and Ed Harris sit across from each other in a room, and in that moment, two men who have both been discarded by the system recognize themselves in each other. That is where the film lives. That is what every other review misses. This video is an independent, transformative work created for review, criticism, commentary, educational, informational, and entertainment purposes. Any third-party content is used only to support original analysis and is not intended to replace or reproduce the original work. The film opens not with an explosion, but with rain falling on a grave. A man in dress blues kneels in front of a headstone that reads, Barbara Elizabeth Hummel. This is General Francis Xavier Hummel, and the woman buried here is everything he has left. She is gone, dead from causes the film never fully explains, and that deliberate vagueness is intentional. His absences cost him her presence. The missions, whatever they were, wherever they took him, always came before coming home. Now Barbara is gone, and Hummel kneels in the rain holding flowers that arrived too late. He places them on her grave with the precision of a man who has spent his entire life following protocol, even in grief. This scene lasts perhaps 90 seconds. There is no exposition. There is no dialogue explaining his motivations. There are only Ed Harris's eyes and the rain and the slow realization on his face that everything he sacrificed for has cost him the one thing that actually mattered. The military teaches men to die for causes larger than themselves. It never teaches them how to live when everyone they love dies while they are away serving those causes. This is the foundation of everything that follows. Not Hummel's rage, but his grief. Not his anger at the system, but his devastation at discovering that the system took his wife while he was being a good soldier. Watch Harris in this moment. There is no theatrical rage. There is only the blank stare of a man whose internal world has collapsed completely and who is standing in the rain trying to understand how to continue existing in a world where Barbara no longer does. What makes The Rock exceptional is that it refuses to reduce Hummel to a one-dimensional terrorist with a list of demands. Instead, the screenplay peels back his history with excruciating precision and care. Hummel has spent 30 years as a decorated Marine commander, a force recon officer who has led men into classified operations so secret that they cannot appear in official records, cannot be discussed at press conferences, cannot be acknowledged by the government that ordered them. His soldiers have died in places their families will never know, for reasons their families will never be allowed to understand, and the government has responded with bureaucratic indifference and silence. Compensation denied, records sealed, bodies sometimes not even returned, families left with nothing but suspicion, grief, and the terrible knowledge that their loved ones died for reasons the country will never acknowledge. Hummel watched this happen again and again across 3 decades. He filed complaints through official channels. He spoke to his superiors. He was told that this was how things worked in special operations. That was the cost of serving in the shadows. That was the price of patriotism. That was the sacrifice the country required. And each time he was told this, each time he was dismissed, each time he was told to stop asking questions, a part of Hummel died inside. The screenplay makes us understand that Hummel's breaking point was not a single moment of rage or betrayal. It was the accumulation of hundreds of small betrayals, each one individually absorbable, but collectively forming an impossible emotional and moral burden. He has spent his entire adult life believing in a system that does not believe in him. He has sacrificed everything for an institution that treats sacrifice as disposable, as expendable, as something to be filed away and forgotten. The genius of Ed Harris's performance is that he plays Hummel not as a villain consumed by hate, but as a man slowly suffocating under the weight of institutional betrayal. There is a moment early in the film when tourists are being led through Alcatraz on a routine guided tour, and Hummel, still in disguise, still moving among the civilians, tells a group of children on the tour to leave, to return to their guide. He does this gently. He does this with a smile. He does this with the politeness of a man who was raised to have manners, who was trained to lead with respect, who even in the moment he is committing treason, even as he is about to seize this island and threaten to launch nerve gas at an entire city, cannot bring himself to harm children. This is not the behavior of a man who has become a monster. This is the behavior of a man who is aware that he is doing something monstrous and is trying, in small deliberate ways, to place limits on his own capacity for destruction. Harris plays every scene with this duality, the decorated officer and the broken man existing simultaneously in the same body, fighting each other. His eyes carry doubt. His voice carries the audible weight of lines he knows he has crossed but cannot uncross. His hands shake slightly when he thinks no one is watching. And we watch a man commit what should be unforgivable acts of terrorism, yet we cannot quite bring ourselves to hate him for it, because we understand, viscerally, emotionally, in our own bones, that the system broke him first. The screenplay does something even more sophisticated and morally complex. It establishes that Hummel's actual plan is not what it initially appears to be to the audience, to the government, to his own men. He has stolen 15 VX gas rockets, genuine weapons of mass destruction, and stationed them strategically on Alcatraz Island, threatening to launch them at San Francisco unless the government pays $100 million to the families of soldiers killed in covert operations that the government will never officially acknowledge happened. This demand is presented to the audience and to the Pentagon as non-negotiable and absolute. But here is the crucial detail that most reviews and most casual viewers gloss over. Hummel never actually intends to fire those missiles. The entire operation is an elaborate bluff, an extremely dangerous, extremely elaborate bluff, designed to demonstrate to his country exactly how far a patriot has to go to make his government listen when every official channel has failed him completely. He has weaponized nerve gas not to destroy San Francisco, not to kill 70,000 people, but to finally force the Pentagon to acknowledge that soldiers and their families matter, that their sacrifices deserve recognition and compensation, that the system cannot simply erase people from history and expect there to be no consequences. Hummel's plan is not terrorism in his mind. It is justice through coercion. It is extortion designed to serve a higher moral purpose. And that distinction, that razor-thin moral line between legitimate violence and illegitimate violence, between justice and terrorism, is where the entire film's tension and moral complexity lives. Because the audience understands his motivation, because we have seen what the system did to him, because we recognize the legitimacy of his anger, we are placed placed in the impossible position of rooting for a man who is threatening to kill 70,000 innocent people. Not because we want those people to die, not because we want the missiles to fire, but because we want the government to finally admit that it was wrong, that it owes a debt, that it cannot continue to sacrifice soldiers without consequence. General Hummel is not introduced to us as a villain. He is introduced to us as a man kneeling at his dead wife's grave in the rain, and that is the most effective character introduction in the entire film. Everything that follows, every threat, every demand, every moment of violence, is made comprehensible by that single image. The audience understands why he is capable of doing this. We understand what broke him. We understand that this is not a man seeking power or money or glory. This is a man seeking justice for the men he has led, recognition for the sacrifices they have made, and compensation for the families left behind with nothing but silence. The film asks us a question that most action movies never ask. What if the villain is right? What if the system actually deserves to be threatened? What if the only way to make an institution listen is to threaten what it values most? Hummel has concluded that the answer to all three questions is yes. And the film, by showing us his dead wife, by showing us his decades of service, by showing us the bureaucratic indifference of the system he served, makes a compelling case that he might be correct. The weight of Hummel's sacrifice becomes even more apparent when we learn the specifics of his service record. He has spent 3 decades, 30 years, in positions where his name could not appear in official reports. 30 years of leading men into operations classified so deeply that even members of Congress do not know they happened. 30 years of watching soldiers die in jungles and deserts and mountains around the world, watching their bodies returned in flag-draped coffins that arrive at Andrews Air Force Base in the middle of the night when no cameras are present, no press is watching, no official acknowledgement can be made. The families of these men receive a folded flag and a letter of condolence, but they never receive the truth about where their sons died, what they were doing when they died, or why their government deemed it necessary to send them into harm's way for purposes that must remain classified forever. Hummel has had to look into the eyes of grieving mothers and fathers and tell them nothing. He has had to comfort widows and say nothing. He has had to attend funerals where the circumstances of death cannot be discussed, where the heroism of the fallen cannot be celebrated, where the sacrifice means nothing in the official record because the operation itself cannot be acknowledged. This is the psychological toll that the screenplay forces us to confront. This is what institutional betrayal actually looks like at ground level. Not dramatic treachery, but the slow, grinding erosion of meaning. What makes this introduction so powerful is that the film does not lecture us about this. It shows us. It shows us Hummel at his wife's grave, and we understand that Barbara died while he was away, that she never got to be proud of her husband's accomplishments because those accomplishments had to remain secret, that she spent 30 years as the wife of a man whose life she could never fully know or understand. The sacrifice was not just military. It was personal, intimate, domestic. It was Barbara's life too. And when she died, Hummel was not there. He was somewhere classified, doing something classified for a government that would never tell her family where he was or why. The film is arguing, through this single scene at the grave, that the military-industrial complex does not just consume soldiers. It consumes their families. It consumes their spouses. It consumes the possibility of normal human connection, of presence, of being home when your wife needs you. Hummel's breaking point was not abstract. It was Barbara's empty chair at the dinner table. It was missing her final weeks. It was arriving home to find that she had already been gone for days. The system took his wife just as surely as if it had put a bullet in her. And now, standing over her grave in the rain, Hummel has made a decision. He will make the system pay. The brilliance of the screenplay is that it establishes Hummel's moral justification before it ever shows us the crime. Before we see him seize Alcatraz, before we see him threaten San Francisco, before we see him weaponize nerve gas, we have already been positioned to understand why he is doing it. We have been made complicit in his reasoning. We have been forced to confront our own assumptions about patriotism, sacrifice, and what a country owes to those who have given everything for it. The film is not asking us to condone Hummel's actions. It is asking us to understand them. And there is a crucial difference between those two things. Understanding does not require approval. Understanding requires only that we see the humanity in someone's choices, even when those choices are objectively wrong. This is what separates The Rock from standard action thrillers. It places moral complexity at the center of the narrative and refuses to resolve that complexity with easy answers or clear villains. As it concludes, we have been introduced to a man who has every legitimate reason to be furious at his country, and who has decided that the only way to make his country listen is through an act of terrorism disguised as justice. The film is asking, is he wrong? The answer the film seems to offer is more nuanced than a simple yes or no. The The answer is, the system is wrong for having created a Hummel in the first place. The system is wrong for treating soldiers and their families as disposable. The system is wrong for demanding infinite sacrifice without reciprocal acknowledgement or compensation. Hummel's response is extreme, but it is not unjustified. It is not the response of a villain. It is the response of a patriot who has lost faith in his country's patriotism toward him. Into this crisis of institutional betrayal walks Stanley Goodspeed, and Nicolas Cage delivers one of the most underrated and nuanced performances of the entire 1990s action cinema. Goodspeed is a civilian chemical weapons specialist, a PhD-level intellectual employed by the FBI precisely because he has absolutely zero field experience, zero combat training, and zero practical ability to function outside the sterile confines of a laboratory environment. He is the opposite of an action hero. He is anxious, bookish, socially awkward, prone to panic attacks, and fundamentally unsuited for violence of any kind. When the Pentagon abruptly calls him in during the Alcatraz crisis, Goodspeed is not given a full briefing on the complexity of the situation or the moral ambiguity of what he is about to be asked to do. He is simply told that there is a rogue general with nerve gas, that a city of 70,000 people is in immediate danger, that time is running out, and that he has been selected because he is the only chemist in the world who understands the internal guidance system on the VX rockets well enough to potentially disarm them before they can be fired. Goodspeed is terrified. He accepts the assignment anyway, not because he is brave, but because he understands that he has no choice, that his country needs him, that people will die without his expertise, that he has been conscripted into a war he did not start and does not fully understand. So he is drafted into an operation he has absolutely no business being part of, sent to Alcatraz with a commando team comprised entirely of men trained for violence, given a mission to stop a man whose actual motivations he cannot possibly comprehend, and told to do it quickly. Cage plays Goodspeed with a twitchy, nervous energy that makes the character instantly and deeply sympathetic to the audience. This is not a man playing tough or pretending to have skills he does not possess. This is a man barely holding it together mentally, cracking jokes to manage his overwhelming anxiety, hyperventilating into paper bags, terrified of violence, and yet thrust directly into its worst and most extreme manifestations. The screenplay is clever enough to pair this panicked intellectual with John Patrick Mason, a mysterious ex-SAS operative played by Sean Connery, and the chemistry between these two actors becomes the true emotional spine of the entire film. Mason is introduced to us in a federal penitentiary, serving a life sentence for crimes he will never discuss. Classified black ops work from decades past that went sideways, that went wrong, that the government decided was easier to lock away than to clean up diplomatically. He has been imprisoned in this cell for 30 years, completely forgotten by the world, abandoned just as thoroughly as the soldiers Hummel fought to protect. Mason is the ghost of exactly what Hummel is afraid of becoming, a man the system used up and then discarded, locked away in a cell while the world moved on, left to rot in prison while the government pretended he never existed. His skills are legendary, his loyalty is beyond question, and his reward for 3 decades of service is a cell and silence. When the FBI approaches Mason about helping them breach Alcatraz and stop Hummel, Mason initially refuses completely. Why would he help a government that abandoned him? Why would he risk his life again for an institution that already proved it does not value his life, that already demonstrated it will betray him if circumstances become politically inconvenient? But Mason is eventually persuaded, with a promise of freedom, with the manipulation of his deep desire to see the ocean one more time, with the old seductive promise that cooperation will finally, after 30 years, earn him the recognition and release he was denied. Mason agrees to help, and in that moment, he is setting himself up for betrayal all over again. He does not yet know this. He does not yet understand what is actually being asked of him, but the film knows it, the screenplay knows it, and we, the audience, sense it. The genius of The Rock is that it places 3 men, Hummel, Goodspeed, and Mason, in impossible situations and gives each of them perfectly valid, perfectly understandable reasons for their positions and their choices. Hummel is trying to force a broken system to acknowledge that it owes a massive debt to the soldiers it sacrificed without recognition or compensation. Goodspeed is an innocent caught in a war he did not create, forced to fulfill a mission that will require him to kill a man whose moral position he increasingly understands and increasingly sympathizes with. Mason is a man given a chance at freedom after 30 years of captivity, gambling desperately on the hope that this time, the system might not betray him again, that this time his sacrifice will actually be reciprocated. The film plays these 3 motivations against each other like instruments in an orchestra, and the tension that emerges from this conflict is not just physical, not just explosions and chases and gunfights, but fundamentally moral and psychological. Because the question the film is asking is, which side is actually right? Is Hummel justified in threatening a city to force the government to acknowledge its debt to fallen soldiers? Is the government justified in using Goodspeed as cannon fodder to stop him? Is Mason justified in risking his life again for a system that has given him absolutely no reason to believe it will keep its word this time? The screenplay refuses to give us easy answers. The screenplay refuses to present this as a simple good versus evil conflict. And that moral ambiguity, that refusal to provide comfortable moral certainty, is what separates this film from the standard action thriller it appears to be on the surface. The relationship that develops between Mason and Goodspeed becomes the human center of the entire narrative. Goodspeed is terrified of Mason initially. He has read Mason's file. He knows Mason's history. He assumes Mason is a dangerous criminal who should never have been released from prison. But as they work together, as they move through Alcatraz, as they face death multiple times, Goodspeed begins to understand that Mason is not a villain. Mason is a soldier who was abandoned by his country. Mason is a man who gave everything and received nothing in return. And when Goodspeed realizes this, when he begins to grasp the true nature of Mason's situation, his respect for Mason transforms into something deeper. It transforms into identification. Because Goodspeed understands, for the first time in his protected academic life, what it actually costs to serve something larger than yourself. He understands, through Mason's presence, that sacrifice is real, that it matters, that it should be acknowledged. The screenplay uses Mason as a bridge for Goodspeed to begin to understand Hummel. And through that understanding, the film forces the audience to understand as well. What makes essential to the film's overall structure is that it takes the moral complexity established and makes it personal and intimate rather than abstract and institutional. We are no longer dealing with vague ideas about military betrayal and systemic injustice. We are dealing with three specific men, Hummel, Goodspeed, and Mason, each of whom has legitimate reasons for their actions, each of whom is trying to do what they believe is right, each of whom will be forced to make impossible choices as the operation unfolds. The film is establishing, through these three characters, that the real conflict in this story is not between good and evil. The real conflict is between competing versions of what justice actually means, between different understandings of what a country owes to those who have sacrificed for it, between the question of whether extreme measures can ever be justified in service of a legitimate moral cause, does not answer these questions, poses them, embeds them in human relationships, and forces the audience to grapple with them as the story continues to unfold. The first time Goodspeed and Mason meet, the screenplay creates a moment of profound tension that goes far beyond simple physical danger. Goodspeed enters Mason's cell in the federal penitentiary, and Mason is sitting calmly on his bunk, as if he has been expecting this visitor for 30 years. Mason has spent 3 decades in confinement, and that confinement has not broken him. It has refined him. He has had 30 years to think about his life, his choices, his country, and what it means to be abandoned by an institution you gave everything to serve. Goodspeed is nervous, uncertain, speaking quickly, explaining the situation with the urgent anxiety of a man who does not belong in a prison. And Mason simply watches him with the patient gaze of a man who has learned that time moves differently when you are locked away. That urgency is a luxury prisoners cannot afford. When Mason finally speaks, his voice is calm, measured, carrying the weight of 30 years of silence. He does not ask many questions. He does not demand much. He simply indicates that he will help. And in that moment, we understand something crucial about Mason. He has already made peace with the possibility of dying. He has already accepted that his life may not matter to his country. He has already concluded that the only thing left to do is to act according to his own conscience, regardless of whether that action will be rewarded or punished. Connery's performance in these scenes is masterful in its restraint. He does not play Mason as a man burning with rage or revenge. He plays Mason as a man who has transcended those emotions through sheer force of will and decades of solitude. As Goodspeed and Mason are transported to Alcatraz, they begin a partnership that is built on mutual respect born from mutual desperation. Goodspeed needs Mason's combat skills and his knowledge of military operations. Mason needs Goodspeed's expertise with the chemical weapons system and his access to the inner circle of the operation. But more importantly, they need each other because they represent different responses to the same institutional betrayal. Mason has responded to his abandonment by withdrawing completely, by accepting his imprisonment as the price of his principles. Goodspeed is responding to his conscription by trying to follow orders while maintaining his moral integrity. And as they work together, as they move through the complex tunnels and corridors of Alcatraz, they begin to understand that they are not actually adversaries. They are allies in a conflict they did not choose. The screenplay uses their developing relationship as a microcosm for the larger moral conflict of the film. If two men who represent such different approaches to institutional betrayal can find common ground, can find respect, and even friendship, then perhaps there is a way forward that does not require total victory or total defeat. Perhaps there is a way to honor both the legitimate demands of justice and the legitimate need to prevent mass casualties. The film takes time to show us the Alcatraz hostages, the tourists and the tour guide who are being held by Hummel's men. And crucially, the screenplay does not make these hostages generic or interchangeable. We see a family. We see elderly people. We see individuals with names and faces and stories. And Hummel, true to his character, has already allowed all the children to leave. He has drawn a line and said that children will not be harmed, that innocence will be protected, that there are limits to what he is willing to do. This detail is crucial. It means that even as Hummel is committing an act that most would call terrorism, he is maintaining standards. He is proving through action that his terrorism has purpose and limitation. He is not interested in random violence or indiscriminate killing. He is interested in forcing a specific outcome, government compensation for the families of fallen soldiers. Everything else, the hostages, the nerve gas, the threat to San Francisco, is leverage. It is tool. It is means to an end. And the film makes us understand that Hummel sees himself not as a terrorist, but as a man using the only language his government has left him, the language of credible threat. Meanwhile, the government's response to the crisis is revealed in scenes involving military and FBI leadership who are terrified, confused, and desperate. They do not understand Hummel's motivation. They see only a rogue general with weapons of mass destruction. They see only the threat. They do not see the grieving widower. They do not see the man who spent 30 years watching soldiers die with their sacrifices unacknowledged. They see an enemy that must be eliminated, and so they authorize increasingly extreme measures. They prepare to firebomb Alcatraz with thermite plasma if the missiles cannot be disarmed. They are willing to kill hostages, willing to destroy the island, willing to do whatever it takes to ensure that Hummel does not succeed. The film is arguing, through these scenes, that the government's response to Hummel's crisis is itself a kind of terrorism. Institutional terrorism, authorized terrorism, terrorism that happens through official channels and therefore feels legitimate. Both Hummel and the government are willing to threaten innocent people to achieve their objectives. Both are playing with weapons of mass destruction. Both claim moral justification. And the only difference between them is that one operates through official authority and the other operates outside of it. The film forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that institutional power often uses the same methods as those it condemns as terrorism. Goodspeed's role in this developing crisis is to serve as the audience's proxy for confusion, moral conflict, and the terrible realization that the world is more complex than he was ever taught. He is being asked to disarm the missiles and stop Hummel, but the more he learns about Hummel, the more he sympathizes with him. He begins to see Hummel not as a villain, but as a man in genuine crisis. And this creates an impossible internal conflict. Goodspeed is being asked to do something that he increasingly understands is morally wrong, to prevent a man from forcing his country to acknowledge a legitimate debt. The screenplay gives Goodspeed moments where he must choose between what he has been ordered to do and what he increasingly believes is morally justified. This is where the film's emotional and moral complexity reaches its apex. We are no longer watching a simple action thriller about stopping a terrorist. We are watching a moral drama about competing claims of justice, about the costs of institutional betrayal, about what it means to serve a system that does not serve you back. The plan is deceptively simple in theory and catastrophically complex in execution. Mason and Goodspeed will be inserted into Alcatraz, disguised as new hostages. They will move through the island's corridors under the cover of the captured tourists, locate the guidance system on the VX missiles, and disarm the threat before Hummel realizes what is happening. The operation is codenamed Dagger, and it represents the government's last hope of preventing mass casualties without actually negotiating with a terrorist. But The Rock refuses to play this infiltration as a standard military thriller where the heroes move through the compound executing a pre-planned strategy with precision and confidence. Instead, the film uses the infiltration as a stage for Goodspeed's psychological unraveling and Mason's quiet, devastating revelation that he understands Hummel better than anyone in the command structure ever could. As they move through the abandoned corridors of Alcatraz, through passageways that echo with decades of institutional brutality, past cells where men have spent lifetimes locked away from sunlight and human contact, through prison kitchens and exercise yards and isolation chambers, the film's subtext becomes becomes increasingly and inescapably clear. Alcatraz itself is a character in this story. It is a visual and spatial manifestation of everything the American system has discarded. Prisoners forgotten, soldiers forgotten, men used up and set aside to rust away in confinement. Mason walks through these halls with a strange calmness, as if returning to a place he recognizes on a fundamental and spiritual level. He has been imprisoned in places just like this for 30 years. For him, Alcatraz is not foreign territory to be conquered. It is home. It is where men like him end up when they stop being useful to the system. It is where the country puts people it no longer needs. The cinematography by John Toll bathes everything in cold, institutional blues and grays, making the island feel less like a fortress and more like a tomb where dreams go to die. Every shadow seems to carry accumulated weight. Every corner seems to hold the concentrated resentment of decades of confinement and abandonment. The production design transforms Alcatraz from a historical tourist attraction into a visual and thematic metaphor for institutional abandonment, and the film's pacing deliberately slows during these sequences, forcing the audience to feel the heaviness of the space alongside the characters, making us complicit in their emotional experience. Goodspeed's psychological role in this infiltration sequence is to serve as the audience's primary proxy for anxiety, moral confusion, and the dawning realization of complicity. As he and Mason move through Alcatraz, Goodspeed begins to understand. Through overheard conversations, through glimpses of Hummel's soldiers, through fragments of context he pieces together exactly what Hummel's actual motivation is. He overhears conversations between soldiers about fallen comrades. He sees the soldiers bearing their discipline, their unmistakable military discipline, but also their quiet resentment of the orders they have been given. He begins to understand that these are not mindless terrorists or mercenaries motivated by money. They are decorated Marines who have followed Hummel because they believe in his cause. They believe that their sacrifice and the sacrifice of their fallen brothers deserves acknowledgement and compensation from the government they served. They believe that Hummel's plan, however extreme, is the only way to force the system to finally admit its debt. And as Goodspeed's understanding of the soldier's motivations deepens, as he realizes that he is surrounded by men who have legitimate grievances, his ability to execute his assigned mission becomes increasingly and visibly compromised. He is being asked to disarm these missiles and neutralize a threat, but he is simultaneously being forced to confront the reality that the man behind the threat is not a cartoon villain with evil intentions. He is a patriot who has concluded, through decades of evidence, that his country no longer deserves his patriotism. The screenplay gives Goodspeed a series of pivotal moments where he must choose between what he has been ordered to do and what he increasingly believes is morally justified and righteous. This is emotional engineering at its most sophisticated and most effective. The audience watches Goodspeed's internal conflict mirror our own internal conflict. We want the hostages saved. We want the missiles disarmed. We want San Francisco protected. But we also do not want Hummel to fail, because his failure means that the system wins again, that sacrifice continues to go uncompensated, that soldiers continue to die in obscurity, that nothing changes, that the cycle of betrayal continues indefinitely. The film places Goodspeed, and therefore places us, the audience, in an impossible and agonizing position. He cannot complete his mission with a clean conscience. He cannot disarm these missiles without betraying the very soldiers the missiles were meant to protect. Mason, meanwhile, begins to actively and deliberately undermine the government's operation, not through direct sabotage that would expose him as a traitor, but through a series of small, calculated choices that buy Hummel time and delay the inevitable confrontation. He moves Goodspeed slowly through the prison corridors when speed is essential. He takes them through areas that delay their progress toward the missile guidance systems. He navigates them into dead ends that require backtracking. He does this with such subtlety, with such plausible deniability, that Goodspeed does not immediately realize what is happening. The screenplay makes the realization gradual. Goodspeed notices the delays. Goodspeed begins to understand the pattern. Goodspeed eventually confronts Mason directly about the deliberate delays, asking if Mason is intentionally slowing their progress. And when Goodspeed finally confronts Mason about this, Mason simply smiles, that characteristic Connery smile, and says something to the effect of, "The general deserves to have his message heard. The general deserves to have his demands taken seriously. The general deserves to force the system to listen, just once, to the soldiers it has betrayed." This is the moment where the film's true allegiance becomes undeniably clear to the audience. Mason, having spent 30 years in a cell because the system deemed him disposable, having given everything to a country that responded with imprisonment and abandonment, has made a conscious choice. He will not help stop Hummel. He will help Hummel succeed. Not because because he wants San Francisco destroyed. Mason is not a monster, not a man consumed by hatred, but because he understands, with absolute certainty, that sometimes the only way to make an institution listen is to threaten what it values most. Mason recognizes in Hummel a man who has done exactly what Mason did, sacrificed everything for a system that did not reciprocate, that did not value him, that discarded him when his usefulness ended. And unlike Goodspeed, who still harbors hope that the system might be redeemed, Mason has no illusions about whether the government will keep its word. He has already been betrayed once. He has already spent 30 years watching the system prove itself untrustworthy. He will not be betrayed twice. He will not place his faith in institutions again. He will place his faith only in Hummel, in the legitimacy of Hummel's cause, in the justice of Hummel's demands. The action sequences in this section of the film are technically spectacular and visually extraordinary. There are chases through narrow prison corridors, firefights in the prison kitchen that transform the space into a war zone, explosions that collapse entire sections of Alcatraz into the ocean below, but they are always subordinate to and in service of the emotional and psychological tension underneath. Director Michael Bay, whatever his later reputation becomes in his subsequent films, demonstrates here that he possesses genuine understanding of how to use action sequences as expressions of character psychology rather than a spectacle for its own sake. When Mason fights Hummel's soldiers, he does so with controlled precision and discipline, minimizing casualties, avoiding lethal force when possible because he respects these men. When Goodspeed is forced into combat situations, the editing becomes deliberately jittery and disorienting, deliberately chaotic, matching his internal panic and his incompetence in combat situations. The camera shakes. The cuts become rapid and confusing. The sound design emphasizes his fear. When Hummel's soldiers move through the island, they move with military discipline and tactical precision, but also with visible reluctance, with the bearing of men who are following orders but questioning whether those orders serve justice. Bay uses editing rhythms, camera movement, sound design, and visual composition to make every action beat communicate something about the character executing that action. The famous car chase that opens the film, where Mason steals a vintage red Ferrari and tears through San Francisco at impossible speeds, weaving through traffic, dodging police, leaving destruction in his wake, is not simply about vehicular excitement or spectacle. It is fundamentally about Mason reclaiming his life. It is about a man who has spent 30 years confined to a cell, who has had 30 years to dream about freedom, who is finally experiencing motion and speed and the physical sensation of freedom. The sequence is visually exhilarating and thrilling, but it is also emotionally grounded in and rooted in the character's psychological and spiritual state. Mason has made his final and irreversible choice. He is no longer helping the government stop Hummel. He is actively helping Hummel execute his plan. Goodspeed senses this shift, observes the patterns in Mason's behavior, but cannot fully grasp the implications of what is happening or what it means for the mission. And Hummel, still unaware of the exact nature and degree of Mason's allegiance and commitment, continues with his operation under the assumption that the government will eventually capitulate, that the threat will be taken seriously, that the government will finally acknowledge its debt. But here is where the screenplay sets up the central and most devastating conflict of the entire film. Hummel's subordinates are not as disciplined or as morally anchored as he is. Captain Darrow and Captain Fry, two rogue officers under Hummel's command, have begun to seriously question whether the bluff is actually a bluff. They have started to suggest, with increasing urgency and conviction, that perhaps the missiles should actually be fired. They argue that the only way to truly force change is to demonstrate, conclusively and irrevocably, that Hummel is willing to kill thousands of people. They argue that threats without consequences are meaningless. They push Hummel toward the brink. This is where Hummel's control begins to slip. This is where his noble act of forced justice begins to transform into something potentially monstrous and uncontrollable. Hummel created a situation where he could theoretically lose control of his own operation, where the men under his command could force him into committing an act of mass murder that he never intended and does not actually desire. And as the stakes escalate exponentially, as the government prepares to firebomb Alcatraz with thermite plasma if the missiles cannot be neutralized, the entire situation spirals toward a climax where everyone, Hummel seeking justice, Goodspeed seeking to save lives, Mason seeking to protect the legitimate cause, the rogue officers seeking to prove Hummel's resolve through actual destruction, and the government seeking to contain the crisis, is moving in different directions, each convinced. They are fighting for justice, each capable of destroying the others. The famous car chase that opens The Rock is more than just kinetic spectacle, though it certainly is spectacular. It is a profound statement about freedom freedom, and what it means for a man who has been imprisoned to experience motion, velocity, and the sheer physical sensation of being alive again. Mason steals a 1963 Ferrari Testarossa, a car worth millions, a car that represents everything about the world outside prison, a car that embodies speed and beauty and possibility, and he drives it through San Francisco at speeds that defy physics and sanity. Police helicopters chase him, police cars pursue him, and Mason drives with the joy and abandon of a man who has nothing left to lose. He has already been betrayed. He has already been locked away. Now, for perhaps the last time in his life, he is going to experience what it feels like to be free. The camera captures his face as he drives, and Connery's expression is one of pure, almost childlike exhilaration. This is not a man committing a crime. This is a man reclaiming his humanity. The sequence demonstrates, through action and visual storytelling, what the entire film is about. What happens when a system takes a man's life, his freedom, his dignity, and he finally decides that he has nothing left to lose by defying it. The chase culminates in Mason being cornered on the Golden Gate Bridge, surrounded by police, facing certain arrest or death. And in that moment, he is rescued by Goodspeed, who arrives in a military vehicle and creates a path for escape. But this rescue is not straightforward. Goodspeed has been ordered to bring Mason to Alcatraz. Goodspeed is following government orders. Yet in the moment of rescue, in the split second where Goodspeed could have allowed Mason to be captured, Goodspeed chooses to save him. This choice is not explicitly explained in dialogue. It is communicated through action, and it signals that Goodspeed, despite his mission briefing, despite his orders, is beginning to see Mason not as a criminal or a tool to be used, but as a human being who deserves better than what the system is offering. This moment of connection between the two men, this moment where Goodspeed could betray Mason but chooses not to, becomes the emotional foundation for their later partnership. When Mason and Goodspeed finally reach Alcatraz and begin their infiltration, they are operating under false pretenses. The government believes they are working to disarm the missiles. Hummel believes they are hostages, but Mason has his own agenda. And as the two men move through the island, as they encounter Hummel's soldiers, as they navigate the claustrophobic corridors of the prison, the question of loyalty becomes increasingly complex. Mason is loyal to Hummel's cause, but not to Hummel's methods. Goodspeed is loyal to saving lives, but increasingly skeptical of the government's methods. And Hummel is loyal to his fallen soldiers, but gradually losing control of his own operation. The screenplay uses physical space, the narrow corridors, the isolated cells, the vast emptiness of the prison, to reinforce the psychological isolation of each character. They are all trapped. They are all running out of options. They are all approaching a point of no return. The government's command center, established in a temporary headquarters overlooking Alcatraz, is in complete chaos. Military leadership is arguing about whether to negotiate, whether to attack, whether to firebomb the island. The FBI is demanding that they attempt the infiltration first. The Pentagon is threatening to take matters into its own hands. And through it all, there is a clock ticking. Hummel has given the government a deadline. After that deadline, the missiles will be activated. After that deadline, either Hummel's demands will be met or San Francisco will be destroyed. The film cuts between the claustrophobic tension inside Alcatraz and the bureaucratic chaos outside it, demonstrating that institutional systems are just as dysfunctional and dangerous as individual rogue actions. Both the government and Hummel are capable of catastrophic decision-making. Both are operating under extreme pressure. Both are running out of time. In this chaos, Mason and Goodspeed move deeper into Alcatraz, deeper into the heart of the operation. They begin to understand the full scope of what Hummel has planned. They realize that the missiles are real, that the threat is genuine, that this is not a bluff designed to fail safely. And they realize that if they succeed in their mission, if they actually disarm the missiles, they will be preventing a demonstration of government accountability. They will be allowing the system to continue its betrayal. They will be choosing institutional preservation over individual justice. This realization transforms the mission from a straightforward task into a moral and philosophical crisis for both men. Goodspeed must decide whether to complete his assignment or to allow Hummel's message to be delivered. Mason must decide whether to help Goodspeed or to help Hummel. The moment where Goodspeed and Mason breach the inner sanctum of Alcatraz is the moment where the film's central conflict transforms from external action into internal moral crisis. They arrive at the chamber where the VX missiles are stored, 15 massive rockets, each one capable of dispersing nerve gas across an entire city, each one pointed at San Francisco, each one representing both Hummel's desperation and his willingness to hold an entire metropolitan area hostage. The missiles are real. The threat is not theoretical. And standing in front of these weapons of mass destruction, Goodspeed experiences a moment of absolute clarity. He understands, with perfect certainty, certainty that he is standing in the presence of a man's final act of protest against a system that has broken him. These missiles represent 30 years of accumulated grievance. They represent every soldier who died unacknowledged. They represent every widow left without explanation. They represent every family that was denied the truth about why their loved one was sent to die in a foreign country for reasons that could never be discussed. The missiles are not just weapons. They are monuments to institutional betrayal, and Goodspeed, facing them, begins to question whether disarming them is actually the right thing to do. Mason, meanwhile, encounters Hummel directly for the first time since arriving on Alcatraz. The meeting between these two men, both betrayed by the system, both decorated soldiers, both men who have paid the ultimate price for their patriotism, is handled with remarkable restraint and emotional power. They do not embrace. They do not cry. They simply recognize each other as kindred spirits, as men who have suffered the same institutional wounds. Hummel tells Mason about his wife. Hummel tells Mason about the soldiers he lost. Hummel tells Mason about the decades of fighting through official channels, the decades of being told that sacrifice is simply the cost of service, the decades of watching the government treat soldiers as disposable. And Mason understands. Mason has lived this exact story. Mason has experienced this exact betrayal. In that moment, the bond between them is cemented. Mason is no longer working for the government. Mason is working for Hummel. Mason has made his choice, and that choice is irreversible. He will help Hummel see his plan through to completion. He will help force the government to acknowledge its debt. He will help ensure that Hummel's message is heard, even if that message is delivered through the threat of mass casualties. Goodspeed, separated from Mason, continues moving through the facility attempting to understand the guidance system on the missiles. But as he works, he begins to comprehend the sophistication of Hummel's plan. The missiles are designed with multiple redundancies. They have backup systems. They have countermeasures against electronic disarming. Hummel, despite his lack of formal engineering training, has worked with some of the finest weapons specialists in the military to create a system that cannot be easily disabled. This detail is crucial because it demonstrates that Hummel's threat is not something that can be easily neutralized by a clever specialist. This is not a situation that can be resolved by a hero disarming the bomb at the last second. Hummel has thought through the logistics. He has anticipated government responses. He has created a system that requires genuine negotiation rather than military intervention. Hummel has forced the government into an impossible position where the only solution is to acknowledge his demands or to accept the consequences of refusal. The screenplay introduces Captain Darrow and Captain Fry, Hummel's subordinates who are beginning to question whether Hummel is actually willing to fire the missiles. These men have signed on to Hummel's operation believing in his moral authority and his judgment. But as the deadline approaches, as the government's refusal to negotiate becomes apparent, these men begin to push Hummel toward actually launching the missiles. They argue that a bluff that is not carried out is meaningless. They argue that Hummel's moral authority depends on demonstrating that he is willing to kill. They argue that the only way to force genuine change is to prove through action that the threat was real. And Hummel begins to lose control. He finds himself in the position of a man who has created a situation designed to force negotiation, but which has developed its own momentum, its own gravitational pull toward violence. The men under his command are pushing him toward a decision he never wanted to make. The government is pushing him by refusing to negotiate, and the clock is ticking toward a deadline that cannot be extended. Hummel is trapped by his own creation. Goodspeed, observing this breakdown in Hummel's control, realizes that the situation is spiraling toward actual disaster. The threat is no longer theoretical. The missiles might actually fire, not because Hummel wants them to fire, but because Hummel has lost the ability to prevent it. The subordinates who have followed Hummel out of respect for his authority and his cause are now willing to defy him. The government's refusal to negotiate is pushing everyone toward a catastrophic outcome, and Goodspeed understands, with perfect clarity, that the only way to prevent mass casualties is to actually disable the missiles. But in doing so, he will be preventing Hummel's message from being delivered. He will be allowing the system to continue its betrayal. He will be choosing institutional preservation over justice. Goodspeed is facing the ultimate moral dilemma, and the film refuses to provide him with an easy answer. Mason, committed to Hummel's cause, begins to position himself to prevent Goodspeed from successfully disarming the missiles. The two men, who have bonded through their shared experience of institutional betrayal, are now positioned as adversaries. But they are adversaries with love and respect for each other. They are adversaries who both believe they are doing the right thing. They are adversaries caught in a system that has forced them into opposition despite their fundamental agreement about what that system has done wrong. And as it concludes, as the deadline approaches, as Hummel's control deteriorates and Goodspeed positions himself himself to prevent catastrophe, and Mason positions himself to allow Hummel's message to be delivered. The entire narrative is approaching the point where everything will be decided. Everything is about to collapse. Everything is about to explode. The deterioration of Hummel's command structure accelerates as the deadline approaches with relentless precision. Captain Darrow, in particular, becomes the embodiment of everything Hummel feared when he initiated this operation. A soldier who has become intoxicated by the prospect of violence, who sees the threatened missiles not as a negotiating tool, but as an opportunity to finally strike back at a system that has wronged him. Darrow's motivation is understandable on one level. He has lost friends. He has watched soldiers die. He has seen families destroyed by the government's indifference. But his response to this trauma is the opposite of Hummel's. Where Hummel seeks accountability through threat, Darrow seeks revenge through actual destruction. Where Hummel maintains moral boundaries, Darrow wants to obliterate them. The screenplay makes clear that Darrow represents the logical endpoint of unchecked institutional betrayal. A man so damaged by the system that he is willing to become a monster in response. He pushes Hummel to authorize the launch. He questions Hummel's resolve. He suggests, with increasing aggression, that Hummel is weak, that Hummel lacks the courage to follow through on his threats, that Hummel's entire operation is meaningless unless he is willing to actually kill thousands of people. These accusations wound Hummel, not because they contain truth, but because they contain a grain of truth. Hummel is wavering. Hummel is losing control. Goodspeed, meanwhile, is experiencing his own crisis of conscience and capability. He has arrived at the guidance system, but he realizes with growing horror that disarming it is far more complex than he anticipated. The system has redundancies. It has fail-safes designed to prevent exactly the kind of disarming he is attempting. Every time he makes progress towards shutting down one system, another activates automatically. It is as if Hummel anticipated that someone like Goodspeed would attempt this and designed the system to be undefeatable through conventional technical means. Goodspeed's hands shake as he works. He is hyperventilating. He is on the edge of panic, and he begins to understand that his expertise, which the government counted on to solve this crisis, might not be sufficient. He might fail. The missiles might launch not because Hummel wants them to launch, but because the system Hummel created is beyond anyone's ability to control or disable. Goodspeed is confronted with the terrifying possibility that he is helpless, that his skills and knowledge are inadequate, that he might be responsible for the deaths of 70,000 people through his failure to prevent it. Mason, observing Goodspeed's struggle, makes a choice that reveals the depth of his commitment to Hummel's cause. He does not kill Goodspeed. He does not prevent him from attempting to disarm the missiles. Instead, he simply watches. He allows Goodspeed to work. He allows the situation to develop. And in that watching, in that refusal to actively prevent Goodspeed's efforts, Mason is making a statement. He trusts that Goodspeed will fail. He believes that the system is truly beyond human control. He believes that the missiles will fire regardless of Goodspeed's efforts. And therefore, Mason can allow Goodspeed to try without actually risking Hummel's plan. This is the depth of Mason's belief in the righteousness of Hummel's cause. He is willing to stake everything on the idea that the system is undefeatable, that the only way forward is through actual destruction and renewal. The government's response to the deteriorating situation becomes increasingly desperate and increasingly dangerous. Military leadership is pushing for a firebombing of the island with thermite plasma, a weapons system designed to create a wall of fire that will incinerate everything in its path. They are arguing that if the missiles cannot be disarmed through Goodspeed's infiltration, then the entire island must be destroyed before the missiles can fire. This means killing everyone on Alcatraz: Hummel, his soldiers, Mason, Goodspeed, and all of the remaining hostages. The government is prepared to commit mass murder in order to prevent mass murder. The government is willing to become a terrorist itself in order to stop terrorism. The film is demonstrating, with devastating clarity, that institutional violence often exceeds the violence it claims to prevent. Hummel, learning of the government's plan to firebomb the island, begins to question his own entire strategy. He never intended for this to happen. He never wanted to create a situation where the government would be forced to choose between negotiating with him and destroying the island entirely. He created this crisis believing that negotiation would eventually occur, that the government would eventually see reason and acknowledge its debt. He did not anticipate that the government would be willing to sacrifice an entire island and everyone on it in order to preserve institutional authority. And that realization, that his own country would rather destroy him and everyone around him than acknowledge the legitimacy of his grievance, is the final breaking point. Hummel's faith in the possibility of negotiated resolution collapses completely. The moment of true crisis arrives when Hummel finally authorizes the launch of the first missile. He does not do this because he wants to kill anyone. He does this because he has concluded that the government will never negotiate, that his entire operation has failed to achieve its goal, that the only way to force acknowledgement is to demonstrate that the threat was real and that he is willing to follow through. But even as Hummel gives this order, even as the countdown begins on the first VX rocket, we see the conflict in his face, the hesitation in his voice, the absolute horror of understanding that he is about to commit an act that will define his entire life and legacy. He is about to become the thing he never wanted to be, a man who kills civilians to make a political point. The missile rises on its launcher. The camera captures it in slow motion, emphasizing the weight and enormity of what is happening. This is not a theoretical threat anymore. This is real. This is happening. And everyone on Alcatraz, everyone in the government command center, everyone watching this unfold understands that the line between negotiation and mass murder has been irrevocably crossed. Goodspeed, observing from his position near the guidance systems, realizes with absolute clarity that he has run out of time. His technical expertise, his careful work, his attempts to understand and disable the system, all of it has been insufficient. The missile is launching. The government's threats to firebomb the island will now become reality. Everyone on Alcatraz will die. 70,000 people in San Francisco will die. And the only man who might have prevented this, the only man who has the technical knowledge and the access to actually disable the missiles, has failed. Mason, witnessing the launch, experiences a moment of profound doubt and recalculation. He has committed to Hummel's cause. He has believed that Hummel would never actually fire the missiles. He has trusted in Hummel's moral character and Hummel's restraint. But now, watching the missile rise into the sky, Mason understands that his trust was misplaced, that Hummel has been broken by the system just as Mason was broken, that the weight of institutional betrayal has finally overwhelmed Hummel's ability to maintain control and restraint. Mason realizes, in this moment, that he has made a terrible mistake. He has chosen the wrong side. He has allowed his hatred of the system to override his judgment about what Hummel was actually capable of doing. And now, as the missile arcs through the sky towards San Francisco, Mason understands that he must act. He must stop the missile. He must prevent the destruction he helped enable. He must find Goodspeed and help him complete the disarming sequence. Mason's choice to support Hummel was based on a belief that Hummel would ultimately choose restraint. Now that Hummel has chosen otherwise, Mason's allegiance must shift. This is the moment where Mason reclaims his own moral agency, where he rejects the path of destruction and commits instead to the path of prevention. He moves toward Goodspeed with urgency and purpose. The missile guidance system that Goodspeed has been attempting to disable suddenly becomes accessible. Not because Goodspeed has solved the puzzle of Hummel's design, but because Mason, knowing the system, understanding Hummel's intentions, provides the final piece of information that makes disarming possible. Mason tells Goodspeed where the manual override is located. Mason tells Goodspeed how to access it. Mason, in this moment, chooses the lives of 70,000 strangers over his commitment to Hummel's cause. He chooses the prevention of mass murder over the delivery of Hummel's message. And in making this choice, Mason makes a statement about the nature of institutional betrayal and moral response. Betrayal does not justify unlimited destruction. Injustice does not permit indiscriminate violence. There are lines that should never be crossed, even in service of legitimate grievance. Goodspeed, using the information Mason provides, manages to activate the manual override just as the first missile is seconds away from deploying its payload over San Francisco. The guidance system shuts down. The missile, instead of releasing its nerve gas payload over the city, instead diverts its trajectory and crashes harmlessly into the ocean. The immediate threat to 70,000 lives has been neutralized, but the crisis on Alcatraz is far from over. Hummel, realizing that his plan has failed, that the first missile has been diverted, experiences a moment of absolute devastation and clarity. He has crossed the line. He has actually attempted to kill innocent people. He has become the monster that the system created when it broke him. And in that moment of horrified understanding, Hummel makes the only decision left available to him. He orders his men to stand down. He orders them to cease fire. He orders them to surrender. He will not fire another missile. He will not continue down the path of destruction. He will accept the consequences of his actions and face whatever punishment the system decides to inflict on him. But Hummel's order comes too late for some of his subordinates. Captain Darrow and Captain Fry, having tasted the possibility of actual violence, having crossed their own moral lines by supporting the first launch, refuse to stand down. They want to fire the remaining missiles. They want to demonstrate to the government, conclusively and irrevocably, that they are willing to destroy the city. They want to transform Hummel's act of coerced justice into an act of pure terrorism. And in that moment, the operation that Hummel created, the organization that Hummel led, tears itself apart. Hummel's men turn against him. Darrow and Fry draw weapons. Major Baxter, Hummel's closest friend and second in command, faces a choice between loyalty to Hummel and survival. The operation that was supposed to force the government to acknowledge its debt has descended into internal conflict, betrayal within betrayal, violence turned inward. Mason and Goodspeed, having prevented the first missile from reaching its target, now find themselves in the middle of an active firefight between Hummel's loyalists and the rebels. The island becomes a battlefield. The tourists who have been held hostage are caught in crossfire. The soldiers who followed Hummel because they believed in his cause are now shooting at each other. And Mason, understanding that Hummel is trying to prevent further destruction, understanding that Hummel is attempting to save lives despite having already crossed the line into attempted mass murder, makes the decision to protect Hummel. Mason positions himself between Darrow and Fry and Hummel. Mason fights against the rebels with the same precision and discipline he demonstrated throughout the film. Goodspeed, despite his pacifism, despite his horror at violence, finds himself in combat situations and forces himself to act despite his fear. Together, they form an alliance with Hummel, an alliance born of necessity and mutual recognition that preventing further destruction is the only moral path forward. The film has constructed a moment where the three men who were supposed to be enemies, the three men who represent different responses to institutional betrayal, are now fighting together against the forces of pure destruction and revenge. They are fighting not to save the system, not to preserve institutional authority, but to prevent innocent people from dying. They are fighting because at some point, despite legitimate grievance, despite justified rage, the prevention of mass murder becomes more important than the delivery of a message. The moment of true crisis arrives when Hummel finally authorizes the launch of the first missile with a voice command that carries the weight of 30 years of accumulated grief and rage. He does not do this because he wants to kill innocent people or because he has embraced the role of terrorist. He does this because he has concluded, with absolute certainty born from decades of institutional rejection, that the government will never negotiate in good faith, that his entire operation has fundamentally failed to achieve its intended goal, that the only way to force genuine acknowledgement and accountability is to demonstrate that the threat was absolutely real and that he possesses the will to follow through on his ultimatum. But even as Hummel gives this catastrophic order, even as the countdown begins on the first VX rocket, even as the machinery of mass destruction whirs to life beneath his command, we see the complete internal conflict displayed across Ed Harris's face. We see the hesitation in his voice. We see the absolute horror of understanding that he is about to cross a threshold from which there is no return, that he is about to commit an act that will define his entire life and legacy, that he is about to become the exact thing he never wanted to become, a man who kills civilians, innocent people, 70,000 human beings, to make a political point. The missile rises on its launcher with terrifying mechanical precision. The camera captures it in slow motion, emphasizing the weight and the enormity and the finality of what is happening. This is not a theoretical threat anymore. This is not a negotiating position. This is real. This is happening. This is actually occurring. And everyone on Alcatraz, everyone monitoring from the government command center, everyone in San Francisco, everyone watching this unfold understands that the line between negotiation and mass murder, between coercion and terrorism, has been irrevocably crossed. Goodspeed, observing from his position near the guidance systems, observing the missile rise toward the sky, observing the countdown on his monitoring equipment, realizes with absolute and overwhelming clarity that he has run out of time. His technical expertise has proven insufficient. His careful work at understanding and disabling the system has been too slow. His attempts to find a solution that did not require actual confrontation have failed completely. The missile is launching. The government's threats to firebomb the entire island will now become immediate reality. Everyone on Alcatraz will die. Hummel, his soldiers, Mason, Goodspeed himself, and all of the remaining hostages. 70,000 people in San Francisco will die. The city will be destroyed. Families will be annihilated. The only man who might have prevented this catastrophe, the only man who possessed the technical knowledge and the necessary access to actually disable the missiles and stop the launch sequence, has failed. Goodspeed's failure is not due to incompetence. His failure is due to the sophistication of Hummel's design, the complexity of the redundancies, the genius-level engineering that Hummel brought to bear to ensure that no simple technical solution could stop what he had set in motion. Goodspeed is forced to confront the reality that expertise is not always sufficient, that intelligence and knowledge do not guarantee success, that sometimes circumstances overwhelm even the best efforts of capable people. Mason, witnessing the missile rise into the sky, witnessing the launch that he helped enable by slowing Goodspeed's progress and providing Hummel with time, experiences a moment moment of profound doubt and immediate recalculation of everything he has believed and committed to throughout this operation. He has committed completely to Hummel's cause. He has believed with absolute certainty that Hummel would never actually fire the missiles, that the threat would remain theoretical, that Hummel's moral character and Hummel's deep restraint would ultimately prevent him from crossing this final line into actual mass murder. But now, watching the missile arc through the sky with devastating trajectory toward San Francisco, Mason understands with terrible clarity that his trust was catastrophically misplaced, that Hummel has been broken more thoroughly than Mason realized by the weight of institutional betrayal, that the accumulated weight of 30 years of sacrifice and abandonment has finally overwhelmed Hummel's ability to maintain moral control and restraint. Mason realizes, in this crystalline moment of horror and recognition, that he has made a terrible, irreversible mistake. He has chosen the wrong side. He has allowed his hatred of the system, his justified anger at institutional abandonment, to override his judgment about what Hummel was actually capable of doing, about where Hummel's breaking point actually was. And now, as the missile arcs through the sky toward San Francisco, as the countdown continues on targeting systems, as thousands of lives hang in the balance, Mason understands with absolute certainty that he must act immediately. He must stop the missile. He must prevent the destruction he actively helped enable. He must find Goodspeed and help him complete the disarming sequence. Mason's choice to support Hummel was based on a legitimate belief that Hummel would ultimately choose restraint over destruction. Now that Hummel has chosen otherwise, now that Hummel has crossed that final line, Mason's allegiance must shift fundamentally and completely. The missile guidance system that Goodspeed has been attempting to disable throughout this section suddenly becomes accessible in a way it was not before. Not because Goodspeed has finally solved the puzzle of Hummel's ingenious design, not because he has cracked the code through sheer technical brilliance, but because Mason, knowing the system intimately, understanding Hummel's intentions and psychology completely, provides the final crucial piece of information that makes actual disarming possible. Mason tells Goodspeed exactly where the manual override is located. Mason tells Goodspeed precisely how to access it. Mason provides the key that unlocks the solution. Mason, in this moment of crisis and clarity, chooses the lives of 70,000 strangers, of innocent civilians who have nothing to do with military politics or institutional betrayal, over his commitment to Hummel's cause. He chooses the prevention of mass murder over the delivery of Hummel's message about military compensation and justice. He chooses human life over political statement. And in making this choice, in this moment of moral recalibration, Mason makes a profound statement about the nature of institutional betrayal and the legitimate limits of moral response to it. Betrayal does not justify unlimited destruction. Injustice does not permit indiscriminate violence. There are lines that should never be crossed, even in service of legitimate grievance, even when anger is completely justified, even when the cause is genuinely righteous. Goodspeed, using the information Mason provides, using the access code and the location details, manages to activate the manual override just as the first missile is literally seconds away from deploying its lethal payload over San Francisco. The guidance system shuts down completely. The targeting computer goes dark. The missile, instead of releasing its nerve gas payload over the city streets where it would drift and disperse and kill 70,000 people, instead diverts its trajectory upward and away and crashes harmlessly into the ocean far from the city. The immediate threat to 70,000 lives has been neutralized. The catastrophe has been prevented, but the crisis on Alcatraz is far from over. The situation is actually far more complicated now than it was before. Hummel, realizing that his plan has failed, that the first missile has been diverted by Goodspeed with Mason's help, experiences a moment of absolute devastation and horrifying clarity. He has crossed the line. He has actually attempted to kill innocent people. He has become the monster that the system created when it broke him, when it abandoned him, when it refused to acknowledge his sacrifice. And in that moment of horrified understanding, Hummel makes the only decision left available to him. He orders his men to stand down immediately. He orders them to cease fire. He orders them to surrender. He will not fire another missile. He will not continue down the path of destruction. He will accept the consequences of his actions. He will face whatever punishment the system decides to inflict on him. But Hummel's order comes too late for some of his subordinates. Captain Darrow and Captain Fry, having tasted the possibility of actual violence, having witnessed the first missile launch and seen that Hummel was truly willing to cross that threshold, refused to stand down. They refused to accept Hummel's order to cease operations. They have spent their careers following orders, subordinating their will to institutional hierarchy, and that subordination has cost them everything. Now, for the first time, they have power. They have have weapons. They have the capability to actually strike back at a system that has betrayed them just as thoroughly as it betrayed Hummel. And they want to fire the remaining missiles. They want to demonstrate to the government conclusively and irrevocably that they are willing to destroy the city. They want to transform Hummel's act of coerced justice, Hummel's attempt to force government accountability, into an act of pure terrorism and revenge. They want to kill because they can, because the power feels good, because the destruction feels like the only adequate response to their own destruction by the system. The screenplay makes clear that Darrow and Fry represent the logical and inevitable endpoint of unchecked institutional betrayal. Men so damaged by the system, so broken by abandonment, that they have become incapable of moral restraint or ethical consideration. They push Hummel to authorize another launch. They question his resolve with aggressive contempt. They suggest, with increasingly open hostility, that Hummel is weak, that Hummel lacks the courage to follow through on his threats, that Hummel's entire operation is meaningless and pathetic if he is not willing to actually kill thousands of people. These accusations wound Hummel deeply, not because they contain truth, but because they contain just enough truth to sting. Hummel is wavering. Hummel is losing control of his own operation. Hummel has created a situation where the men under his command, the soldiers he led into this crisis, are now willing to push him beyond the limits he intended to maintain. The tension between Hummel and his subordinates escalates into open mutiny. Darrow draws his weapon. Fry draws his weapon. And suddenly, Hummel's command structure, which has been based on respect and shared purpose and common grievance, collapses into violence and betrayal. Major Baxter, Hummel's closest friend and second in command, a man who has followed Hummel through decades of service and into this final act of protest, faces an impossible choice. He can remain loyal to Hummel, which means potentially dying when Darrow and Fry decide that he is an obstacle to their goal. He can join the mutineers, which means betraying the man he has respected and followed for 30 years. There is no good choice. There is only the choice between different kinds of betrayal and different kinds of death. Baxter appears to join the mutineers. He seems to turn his weapon toward Hummel. But in a moment of extraordinary moral clarity and loyalty, Baxter fires on Darrow and Fry instead, choosing friendship and principle over survival and safety. Baxter's choice is the inverse of Mason's earlier choice, where Mason chose to prevent mass murder even though it meant abandoning his commitment to Hummel's cause. Baxter chooses loyalty to Hummel even though it costs him his life. Both men are making moral decisions. Both men are acting according to principles. But the content of those principles leads them to different conclusions about what is actually right in this moment of crisis. Mason and Goodspeed, having prevented the first missile from reaching its target, now find themselves caught in the middle of an active firefight between Hummel's loyalists and the rebels. The island becomes a chaotic battlefield. The tourists who have been held hostage are caught in the crossfire. The soldiers who followed Hummel because they believed in his cause, who trusted in his moral authority and his judgment, are now shooting at each other. The operation that was supposed to force the government to acknowledge its debt to fallen soldiers has descended into internal violence and mutual destruction. And Mason, understanding clearly that Hummel is trying to prevent further destruction, understanding that Hummel is attempting to save lives despite having already crossed the line into attempted mass murder, makes the decision to protect Hummel. Mason positions himself between Darrow and Fry and Hummel. Mason fights against the rebels with the same precision and discipline and ruthless efficiency he demonstrated throughout the film. Goodspeed, despite his pacifism, despite his philosophical and emotional horror at violence of all kinds, finds himself in active combat situations and forces himself to act despite his consuming fear. Together, Mason and Goodspeed form an alliance with Hummel, an alliance born of necessity and mutual recognition that preventing further destruction is the only moral path forward in this moment. The film has constructed a moment where the three men who were supposed to be enemies, the three men who represent different responses to institutional betrayal and institutional injustice, are now fighting together against the forces of pure destruction and revenge. The firefight that erupts across Alcatraz is visually stunning and emotionally devastating. The camera work by John Toll captures both the kinetic energy of combat and the human cost of violence. We see soldiers falling. We see Hummel's face as he watches his men die. We see the tourists huddled in fear. We see Goodspeed forcing himself to act despite his horror. We see Mason fighting with precision and control. And we see Hummel attempting to prevent further violence even as violence erupts all around him. The film refuses to make this sequence simple or easily heroic. This is not a moment of triumph. This is a moment of tragic necessity. These men are fighting because at some point, despite legitimate grievance, despite justified rage, despite the genuine wrongs that have been committed targeted against them, the prevention of mass murder becomes more important than the delivery of a political message. They are fighting not to save the system, not to preserve institutional authority, not to protect government interests. They are fighting because 70,000 innocent people will die if they do not fight. They are fighting because human life is more valuable than any message, any principle, any political statement. Fry, the final rebel officer, manages to get a shot off at Hummel. Hummel falls, and as he is dying, as he understands that his operation has failed, that his attempt to force government accountability has resulted in his own death, Hummel tells Goodspeed where the final rocket is located. With his last breath, Hummel helps prevent the final catastrophe. With his last action, Hummel chooses prevention over destruction. With his final moment, Hummel redeems himself by ensuring that no more missiles will be fired. The resolution of the firefight comes when Fry, the last active rebel, is neutralized. The island is secured. The remaining missiles are confirmed to be non-operational. The government's firebombing threat can be stood down. The hostages are safe. 70,000 people in San Francisco have been spared, but the cost has been enormous. Hummel is dead. Baxter is dead. Many of Hummel's soldiers are dead. The operation has failed. The government has not acknowledged its debt. The families of fallen soldiers have not received compensation. The system has not changed, and yet something fundamental has shifted. Hummel's attempt to force accountability, even though it failed in its primary objective, has exposed the system's vulnerabilities. It has demonstrated that soldiers, when pushed too far, when betrayed too thoroughly, will resist with violence. It has shown that institutional indifference has limits, that there are breaking points beyond which loyalty transforms into mutiny. The film is suggesting that Hummel's sacrifice, even though he died, even though he failed to achieve his goal, might catalyze change in ways that decades of official petitions never could. Goodspeed, covered in dust and blood, stands over Hummel's body. Mason stands beside him, and both men understand that they have just witnessed something profound: the death of a patriot, the failure of a just cause, the tragedy of a system that breaks the men who serve it and then punishes them for breaking. The mutiny that erupts within Hummel's command structure is not a sudden or unexpected event. It is the inevitable result of everything that has been building throughout the operation. Darrow and Fry have followed Hummel because they believed in his cause, because they trusted his judgment, because they saw in him a leader who had finally decided to fight back against the system that had betrayed them. But following orders, subordinating individual will to command authority, is exactly what created the problem in the first place. It is exactly the institutional hierarchy that allowed the government to send soldiers to their deaths without acknowledgement or compensation. And now, having tasted the possibility of actual power, having experienced the moment when Hummel authorized the first missile launch, Darrow and Fry realize that they do not need to follow Hummel anymore. They do not need to subordinate themselves to his moral authority. They have weapons. They have access to the missiles. They have the capability to act according to their own judgment and their own rage. The screenplay demonstrates that Darrow and Fry are not evil men in any abstract sense. They are broken men who have been further broken by being given power and then being asked to relinquish that power. They have experienced, for a moment, the feeling of being in control, of being able to strike back, of being able to hurt the system the way the system has hurt them. And they do not want to give that up. They want to continue the launch sequence. They want to fire more missiles. They want to prove that Hummel is weak and they are strong, that they have the courage to follow through on threats while Hummel does not. When Hummel orders the cessation of the operation, when he orders his men to stand down and prepare for surrender, Darrow and Fry immediately and explicitly refuse. They question his authority. They challenge his resolve. They threaten him directly. And in that moment, the command structure that Hummel created, the hierarchy that was supposed to allow him to control the operation, becomes a weapon against him. Hummel has organized these men. Hummel has trained them. Hummel has given them purpose and direction. And now those same men are turning that training and that organization against him. The film demonstrates that you cannot create a military operation, cannot arm soldiers, cannot encourage them to fight against institutional authority, and then expect them to simply stand down when you decide that you have gone far enough. You cannot ask men to cross one line and then expect them not to cross the next line. Institutional betrayal breeds institutional betrayal. Violence breeds more violence. And once you have set these forces in motion, controlling them becomes nearly impossible. Hummel has created a monster, and now the monster is turning on him. Major Baxter, Hummel's second in command, occupies the most tragic position in the entire film. Baxter has followed Hummel for decades. Baxter has fought beside him in Black Ops missions around the world. Baxter has watched the same soldiers die. Baxter has experienced the same institutional abandonment. Baxter has every legitimate reason to support Darrow and Fry, every reason to believe that continuing the operation and firing more missiles is the correct course of action. But Baxter also has has something that Darrow and Fry have lost. He has maintained a connection to Hummel as a person, not just as a leader. He sees Hummel's humanity. He understands what Hummel is experiencing in this moment of crisis and moral collapse. And when Baxter is forced to choose between loyalty to his friend and participation in mass murder, Baxter chooses loyalty. Baxter draws his weapon not on Hummel, but on Darrow and Fry. Baxter fires on the mutineers. Baxter attempts to save Hummel's life and prevent the further launch of missiles. And for making this choice, for choosing principle over self-preservation, Baxter is shot and killed. Baxter dies defending a man who has just ordered the cessation of the operation that Baxter has committed his life to. Baxter dies trying to prevent further violence. Baxter dies because he believed that friendship and loyalty matter more than ideology and rage. The film treats Baxter's death as tragic because it is. A good man dies because the system broke other men, and those broken men decided to respond with more destruction. The firefight that erupts across Alcatraz Island transforms the location from a prison into an active war zone. The government forces monitoring from outside the island, seeing the new outbreak of violence, believe that Hummel is attempting to launch more missiles. They begin preparations to firebomb the island. The situation is spiraling completely out of control. No one outside Alcatraz understands what is actually happening inside, that Hummel is trying to prevent further missile launches, that Hummel has ordered his men to stand down, that the violence erupting is internal mutiny rather than external attack. The government is prepared to destroy the entire island based on incomplete and inaccurate information. The system, in its attempt to contain the crisis, is about to create a catastrophe far worse than anything Hummel actually intended. Mason, witnessing this internal conflict, this breakdown of Hummel's command structure, makes a series of rapid-fire decisions about how to act. Mason has already committed to preventing mass murder by helping Goodspeed disarm the first missile. Mason has already switched his allegiance from pure support of Hummel's cause to support for preventing further destruction. And now, seeing Hummel attempting to restore order, seeing Hummel trying to prevent Darrow and Fry from launching more missiles, Mason commits himself fully to protecting Hummel and supporting Hummel's effort to end the operation. Mason moves through the firefight with lethal precision. He neutralizes threats. He protects Hummel. He works alongside Goodspeed to contain the situation. And in doing so, Mason transforms from a man seeking revenge against the system into a man seeking to prevent catastrophe. Mason has come full circle. He began in prison, discarded by the system. He joined Hummel's operation seeking to force accountability. He helped slow Goodspeed's progress in disarming the missiles. And now he is fighting to prevent those same missiles from being launched by Darrow and Fry. Mason's journey is the most complete character arc in the film. He begins believing that the system deserves to be threatened. He ends believing that preventing mass murder is more important than forcing the system to change. Goodspeed, throughout this firefight, is forced to act in ways that contradict everything about his personality and his values. He is a pacifist forced into combat. He is an intellectual forced to become a soldier. He is a man who fears violence forced to commit violence. And yet Goodspeed acts. Goodspeed fights. Goodspeed does what is necessary to prevent further disaster. Goodspeed's transformation is not as dramatic as Mason's transformation, but it is perhaps more meaningful because it requires Goodspeed to act against his fundamental nature. Goodspeed discovers that he is capable of more than he believed. Goodspeed discovers that sometimes preventing mass murder requires doing things you never thought yourself capable of doing. The aftermath of the firefight on Alcatraz is a landscape of devastation and moral reckoning. The island that was supposed to be a stage for forcing government accountability has become a tomb. Bodies are scattered across corridors and chambers. Blood stains the floors where some of the finest soldiers in the military have fallen, not to enemy fire, but to bullets from their own brothers in arms. Hummel, gravely wounded, sits against a wall while Goodspeed attempts to provide what medical care he can with limited resources and zero formal training. Mason stands guard, still scanning for threats, still operating in combat mode, even though the active fighting has ceased. The tourists who were held hostage are being evacuated by Navy personnel who have secured the island. The missiles are confirmed to be permanently disabled and pose no further threat to San Francisco. The operation that was supposed to change everything has ended in failure and death. And yet, in this moment of complete defeat, Hummel speaks. With his last breath, with blood on his lips, Hummel tells Goodspeed where the final rocket is located. Hummel provides the final piece of information necessary to ensure that no missiles can be launched. Hummel uses his final moment on Earth to guarantee that his own failure does not result in mass casualties. This is the redemptive moment that defines Hummel's entire character arc. He has failed to force government accountability. He has failed to achieve compensation for the families of fallen soldiers. He has failed in every objective measure of success. But in his failure, in his death, Hummel chooses to prevent the worst possible outcome. Hummel chooses human life over his political cause. Hummel chooses to end the operation rather than allow it to spiral into pure destruction. And in making this choice, Hummel transforms from a man committing terrorism into a man attempting redemption, even as that redemption comes too late and costs him everything. Mason holds Hummel as he dies. The camera captures this moment with remarkable restraint and emotional power. Two men who began this story on opposite sides, who were positioned as adversaries, who could have been enemies, die together with mutual respect and understanding. Mason understands why Hummel did what he did. Mason understands the institutional betrayal that drove Hummel to this point. Mason understands that Hummel was not evil or corrupt or power-hungry. Hummel was a broken man who was finally pushed beyond his breaking point by a system that treated him and his soldiers as disposable. And as Hummel dies, Mason realizes that this is what the system does. It breaks people. It uses them up. It discards them. And when those people finally respond with violence, the system calls them terrorists and criminals and threats to national security. The system never acknowledges its own role in creating the conditions that lead to this violence. The system never admits that it broke these men first. The system simply eliminates them and moves on, waiting for the next patriot to be broken by decades of sacrifice and abandonment. Mason's presence in this moment is crucial because Mason represents the continuation of this story. Mason survived 30 years in prison. Hummel did not survive the consequences of his attempt to force accountability. But Mason will continue to exist in a world where the system continues to operate unchanged, where other soldiers will continue to be sacrificed, where other families will continue to go without compensation or acknowledgement. The film is suggesting that Hummel's death, even though it is tragic, might plant seeds for future change. Hummel's attempt, even though it failed, might inspire others to demand accountability. Hummel's sacrifice, even though he did not intend it as sacrifice, might finally force the system to confront what it has done. Goodspeed stands over Hummel's body and experiences a moment of profound moral and psychological transformation. Goodspeed came to Alcatraz as a government scientist, as an instrument of institutional authority, as a man tasked with preventing terrorism and protecting American lives. But Goodspeed leaves Alcatraz having learned something fundamental about institutions, about justice, about the costs of institutional betrayal. Goodspeed has seen that the system he serves, the government he works for, has created conditions where a decorated general feels forced to threaten mass casualties in order to force acknowledgement of a legitimate debt. Goodspeed has seen that the system's response to Hummel's crisis is not introspection or reform, but firebombing and elimination. Goodspeed has seen that the government is willing to kill everyone on an island, including hostages, including soldiers, including innocent people, in order to preserve its authority and prevent anyone from successfully challenging it. Goodspeed will return to his laboratory, will return to his role as a chemical weapons expert, will return to his position within the government. But Goodspeed will never be the same person he was before this operation. Goodspeed now understands, viscerally and completely, that the system he serves is capable of tremendous injustice. Goodspeed now understands that sometimes the people the system calls terrorists are actually patriots who have been broken by that system. Goodspeed now understands that preventing mass murder sometimes requires you to question the system you work for rather than blindly following orders. The film suggests that Goodspeed, having learned this lesson, having experienced this moral reckoning, will be a different kind of government employee going forward. Goodspeed will be the kind of person who asks questions, who resists orders when they seem unjust, who thinks about the human cost of institutional policies rather than simply executing those policies without reflection. Mason, having survived the operation, having helped prevent mass casualties, having witnessed Hummel's death, faces an uncertain future. Mason was promised freedom in exchange for his help. Mason was told that cooperating with the government would finally earn him recognition and release from prison. But the government has a history of breaking its promises. The government has a history of using people and then discarding them. Mason has already been betrayed once. Mason has no reason to believe that this time will be different. The film ends with Mason standing on the deck of a Navy vessel, looking out at the San Francisco skyline, having been granted his freedom, but not having been granted the one thing he actually wanted: acknowledgement that he was right, that the system was wrong, that his 30 years in prison were unjust and unnecessary. The government has contained a crisis. The government has eliminated the threat. The government has prevented the delivery of Hummel's message. And the government has done all of this while maintaining that it did nothing wrong, that its policies are just, that its treatment of soldiers like Hummel and Mason is appropriate and necessary. The system has survived unchanged. The system has adapted and overcome. come. The system has sacrificed Hummel and accepted the temporary disruption caused by his operation, but the system has not fundamentally changed or acknowledged its role in creating conditions where such an operation became possible. The final scenes show us the immediate aftermath and the beginning of institutional damage control. Government officials are already crafting narratives about what happened. They are already framing Hummel as a rogue general, as a terrorist, as a man who went insane due to grief and institutional stress. They are already working to ensure that the legitimate aspects of Hummel's grievance, the real and documented failures of the system to compensate the families of fallen soldiers, are buried beneath layers of official rhetoric about national security and the necessity of hard choices in defense policy. The film shows us that the system is remarkably effective at neutralizing threats not through force alone, but through narrative control, through the ability to define what happened and why, through the power to ensure that the official story becomes the only story that gets told. Hummel attempted to force accountability through the threat of violence, but the system can survive violence. The system can survive military operations and failed coups and rogue generals. What the system cannot survive is sustained public awareness of its failures and sustained public demand for accountability. And that awareness, that demand, died with Hummel on Alcatraz. The system has won. The system has survived. And the system has learned a valuable lesson. It can break people. It can push them to the point where they commit acts of terrorism. And when they do, it can simply eliminate them and move on without ever having to acknowledge its own role in the tragedy. The immediate aftermath of the firefight on Alcatraz Island is a landscape of devastation and profound moral reckoning that extends far beyond the physical destruction visible across the prison's corridors and chambers. The island that was supposed to be a stage for forcing government accountability has transformed into something far more tragic, a tomb, a monument to the failure of institutional change, a place where the best efforts of broken men have resulted only in more death and more abandonment. Bodies are scattered across the corridors and chambers and prison yards. Blood stains the floors where some of the finest soldiers in the American military have fallen, soldiers who spent their careers serving their country with distinction and honor, now dead not to enemy fire from external adversaries, but to bullets from their own brothers in arms, soldiers they trained with, soldiers they trusted, soldiers they followed into this final operation. Hummel, gravely wounded from multiple gunshot wounds, his uniform torn and bloodied, his body shutting down from catastrophic trauma, sits against a cold concrete wall while Goodspeed, desperately and hopelessly, attempts to provide whatever medical care he can manage with absolutely zero formal medical training and with resources limited to what he can find in a prison first aid kit. Mason stands guard nearby, still scanning horizons for threats that no longer exist, still operating in combat mode and tactical awareness even though the active firefighting has completely ceased and the danger has passed. The tourists who were held hostage throughout this operation are being rapidly evacuated by Navy personnel who have now secured the island and established perimeter control. The 15VX missiles are confirmed to be permanently disabled and pose no further threat to San Francisco or any other population center. The chemical weapons threat that triggered this entire crisis has been neutralized. The operation that Hummel designed and executed, the operation that was supposed to change everything and force the government to finally acknowledge its debt to fallen soldiers, has ended in complete failure and in death. And yet, in this moment of absolute defeat and moral collapse, Hummel speaks. With his final breath, with blood on his lips and his life force draining away, with full awareness that he is dying, Hummel tells Goodspeed exactly where the final rocket is located. Hummel provides the final crucial piece of information necessary to ensure that no remaining missiles can be launched by anyone who might attempt to continue his operation. Hummel uses his final moment of consciousness on Earth to guarantee that his own failure, his own death, his own inability to achieve his stated objectives does not result in mass casualties and the deaths of 70,000 innocent people. This moment is the redemptive scene that defines Hummel's entire character arc and his moral legacy. He has failed to force government accountability. He has failed to achieve meaningful compensation for the families of fallen soldiers. He has failed in every objective measure of military or political success. His operation has been stopped. His command structure has collapsed. His men are dead. But in his failure, in his final moments, in his approaching death, Hummel chooses to prevent the worst possible outcome from occurring. Hummel chooses human life, the lives of innocent civilians, over his political cause and his stated objectives. Hummel chooses to end the operation rather than allow it to spiral into pure destruction and uncontrolled terrorism. And in making this choice, in this final act of will and morality, Hummel transforms from a man committing terrorism into a man attempting attempting redemption, even though that redemption comes catastrophically too late and costs him everything he has left. Mason holds Hummel as he dies, cradling him with the respect and affection of a soldier who has recognized in another soldier something fundamental and true. The camera captures this moment with remarkable restraint and profound emotional power, refusing to make it melodramatic or excessively sentimental. Two men who began this story positioned on opposite sides. Two men who could have been enemies fighting to the death. Two men separated by decades of different institutional experiences, die together with mutual respect and with a complete understanding of each other's humanity. Mason understands precisely why Hummel did what he did. Mason understands completely the institutional betrayal that drove Hummel to the point where he felt forced to commit this act of terrorism disguised as justice. Mason understands that Hummel was not evil or corrupt or motivated by power or money or any of the conventional explanations for terrorism. Hummel was a broken man, a patriotic man, a man who loved his country so desperately that he was willing to threaten its largest cities when he concluded that his country had stopped loving him back. Hummel was pushed beyond his breaking point by a system that treated him and his soldiers as disposable, as expendable, as human resources to be used and discarded without acknowledgement or compensation. And as Hummel dies in Mason's arms, as Mason feels the life drain from the body of a man he has come to respect deeply, Mason realizes with terrible clarity exactly what the system does. It breaks people. It uses them up. It extracts everything of value from them. It discards them when they are no longer useful. And when those people finally respond to this betrayal with violence, when those people finally strike back in an attempt to force accountability, the system calls them terrorists and criminals and threats to national security. The system never acknowledges its own role in creating the conditions that led to this violence. The system never admits that it broke these men first, that it created them, that it bears responsibility for what they became. The system simply eliminates them and moves on, waiting patiently for the next patriot to be broken by decades of sacrifice and abandonment, waiting for the next decorated officer to reach his breaking point. Mason's presence in this final moment is crucial to the film's meaning because Mason represents the continuation of this tragic cycle. Mason survived 30 years in prison. Mason endured imprisonment without becoming a monster. Mason maintained his humanity and his principles despite decades of institutional abandonment. But Hummel did not survive the consequences of his attempt to force accountability. Hummel's attempt to change the system through dramatic action has resulted only in his death. But Mason will continue to exist in a world where the system continues to operate unchanged, where other soldiers will continue to be sacrificed in Black Ops missions, where other families will continue to go without compensation or acknowledgement, where the cycle of betrayal will continue to replicate itself generation after generation. The film is suggesting, through Mason's survival and Hummel's death, that Hummel's attempt, even though it failed by every measurable standard, might plant seeds for future change. Hummel's operation, even though it was stopped and prevented from achieving its objectives, might inspire others to demand accountability. Hummel's sacrifice, even though he did not conceive of his death as a sacrifice in any conventional sense, might finally force the system to confront what it has done and what it continues to do to the soldiers who serve it faithfully. Goodspeed stands over Hummel's body in the final moments after his death, and the young chemist experiences a moment of profound moral and psychological transformation that will reshape everything he understands about institutions, about justice, about the true costs of institutional betrayal that extends far beyond individual soldiers into entire families and entire generations. Goodspeed came to Alcatraz Island as a government scientist, as an instrument of institutional authority, as a man tasked with preventing terrorism and protecting American lives from threats both foreign and domestic. Goodspeed was brought into this operation because he possessed specialized knowledge that the government needed, because he could be used as a tool to neutralize Hummel's threat, because the government viewed him as a resource to be deployed in service of national security. But Goodspeed leaves Alcatraz having learned something fundamental and devastating about institutions, about justice, about the true nature of the system he has served his entire career. Goodspeed has witnessed firsthand that the system he works for, the government he has always trusted with his loyalty and his expertise, has created the conditions where a decorated general, a man with an impeccable record of service and sacrifice, felt forced to threaten mass casualties in order to force the government to acknowledge a legitimate debt owed to fallen soldiers and their families. Goodspeed has seen that the system's response to Hummel's crisis is not introspection or institutional reform or acknowledgement of failure. Instead, the system's response is containment and elimination. operation. The system is willing to firebomb an entire island. The system is willing to kill hostages. The system is willing to create catastrophe in order to prevent anyone from successfully challenging its authority or forcing it to acknowledge its failures and its debts. Goodspeed has seen that the government is fundamentally more concerned with preserving its own power and institutional authority than with actually serving the people it claims to protect or honoring the soldiers who have sacrificed everything for it. Goodspeed will return to his laboratory. Goodspeed will return to his role as a chemical weapons expert. Goodspeed will return to his position within the government's institutional hierarchy and organizational structure. Goodspeed will continue to work for the same system that was willing to firebomb Alcatraz, willing to kill hostages, willing to prioritize institutional authority over human life. But Goodspeed will never be the same person he was before this operation. Goodspeed now understands, viscerally and completely, in his bones and in his conscience, that the system he serves is capable of tremendous injustice. Goodspeed now understands that sometimes the people the system calls terrorists are actually patriots who have been broken by that same system. Goodspeed now understands that preventing mass murder sometimes requires you to question the system you work for rather than blindly following orders without reflection or moral consideration. Goodspeed now understands that he has agency, that he has the ability to resist, that he does not have to simply accept whatever directives come from above without asking whether those directives serve justice or serve only institutional preservation. The film suggests that Goodspeed, having learned this lesson through blood and trauma and witnessing death, will be a different kind of government employee going forward. Goodspeed will be the kind of person who asks difficult questions. Goodspeed will be the kind of person who resists orders when those orders seem unjust. Goodspeed will be the kind of person who thinks about the human cost of institutional policies rather than simply executing those policies without reflection or moral evaluation. The system gained a chemist who disarmed its missiles, but the system also created someone who will spend the rest of his career questioning whether the system deserves the loyalty it demands. Mason, having survived the operation, having fought to prevent mass casualties, having witnessed Hummel's death and understood Hummel's final act of redemption, faces an uncertain and deeply complicated future. Mason was promised freedom in exchange for his cooperation and his help infiltrating Alcatraz. Mason was told, explicitly and with seeming sincerity, that cooperating with the government would finally earn him recognition and release from the prison where he has spent 30 years of his life in isolation and abandonment. Mason was given hope that this time, this one time, the system might actually keep its word and honor its commitment. But Mason has lived a life that has taught him to distrust such promises. The government has a documented history of breaking its promises. The government has a documented history of using people for their skills and value and then discarding them without acknowledgement or compensation. Mason has already been betrayed once by the system he served faithfully for decades. Mason has lived 30 years with the knowledge that the country he died for, the country he sacrificed for, the country he risked everything to serve, decided that he was more valuable locked in a cell than he was as a free man contributing to society. Mason has no rational reason to believe that this time will be different, that this time the government will actually honor its word, that this time his sacrifice will be acknowledged and his freedom will be guaranteed. The film ends with Mason standing on the deck of a Navy vessel, standing in the open air after 30 years of confinement, looking out at the San Francisco skyline that he helped save from destruction, having been granted his freedom but not having been granted the one thing he actually desperately wanted: acknowledgement that he was right, that the system was wrong, that his 30 years in prison were unjust and unnecessary, that the government owes him a debt that extends far beyond a simple release. The government, in the immediate aftermath of the Alcatraz operation, begins the process of institutional damage control and narrative construction with remarkable efficiency and institutional precision. Government officials are already crafting official narratives about what happened on the island. They are already working to frame Hummel as a rogue general, as an unstable and dangerous man, as a terrorist motivated by grief and psychological breakdown. They are working to ensure that the legitimate aspects of Hummel's grievance, the real and documented failures of the system to compensate the families of soldiers killed in covert operations, are completely buried beneath layers of official rhetoric about national security and the necessity of hard choices in defense policy. They are already working to ensure that Hummel's operation is remembered as an isolated incident caused by one man's psychological breakdown, rather than as a symptom of systemic failure and systemic injustice. The film shows us that the system is remarkably effective at neutralizing threats not through force alone, though force is certainly part of the equation, but through narrative control and the ability to define what happened and why. The system possesses the power to ensure that the official story becomes the only story that gets told, that alternative narratives are suppressed or discredited, that the truth about institutional failure remains hidden from public view. Hummel attempted to force accountability through the threat of violence and through the dramatic seizing of an island and holding of hostages. But the system can survive violence. The system can survive military operations and failed coups and rogue generals threatening with weapons of mass destruction. The system possesses the institutional resilience to absorb even significant challenges to its authority. What the system cannot survive, what the system genuinely fears, is sustained public awareness of its failures and sustained public demand for accountability. That awareness, that righteous public anger, that demand for change, died with Hummel on Alcatraz. Hummel's operation, even though it was ultimately stopped and prevented from achieving its stated objectives, had the potential to inspire sustained public demand for reform and accountability. But Hummel is dead. Hummel's message has been contained. Hummel's operation has been eliminated, and the system has already begun the process of reframing the narrative in ways that neutralize Hummel's impact and ensure that the public understanding of what happened is completely aligned with institutional interests. The system has won. The system has survived. The system has adapted and overcome this challenge. And the system has learned a valuable lesson from Hummel's operation. It can break people. It can push them to the point where they commit acts of terrorism in pursuit of justice. And when they do, it can simply eliminate them and move on without ever having to acknowledge its own role in the tragedy or its own responsibility for creating the conditions that led to the violence. The system is self-perpetuating and self-protecting. The system is designed to survive challenges and to emerge stronger from conflict. The system will continue to sacrifice soldiers. The system will continue to deny compensation to families. The system will continue to operate as it always has. And there will be another Hummel, another broken patriot, another decorated officer pushed to the breaking point. And the system will eliminate that person as well. The institutional machinery of damage control and narrative reconstruction begins its work with frightening speed and remarkable efficiency. Within hours of Hummel's death, within hours of the missiles being secured and disabled, within hours of the hostages being evacuated and the island being declared secure, government officials at the highest levels are already meeting in secure conference rooms to discuss how to present this incident to the American public and to the international community. The question being debated is not whether the government bears any responsibility for creating the conditions that led to Hummel's operation. The question is not whether the government should acknowledge its debt to fallen soldiers and their families. The question is purely and simply how to frame the narrative in ways that minimize damage to institutional authority and government credibility. The Pentagon begins drafting official statements characterizing Hummel as mentally unstable, as suffering from severe psychological trauma, as a man whose grief over his wife's death had unbalanced his mind to the point where he could no longer think clearly or act rationally. This narrative is extremely effective because it contains just enough truth to be believable. Hummel is grieving. Hummel's wife is dead. But the narrative completely obscures the fact that Hummel's grief was legitimate, that Hummel's anger was justified, that Hummel's operation was motivated not by insanity, but by rational understanding of systemic injustice. The narrative transforms Hummel from a broken patriot into a cautionary tale about the dangers of psychological instability and the importance of mental health screening in the military. The government also begins the process of ensuring that very few people ever learn the actual details of what happened on Alcatraz. The hostages are debriefed extensively and are pressured to sign non-disclosure agreements that prevent them from discussing the specifics of Hummel's operation, his stated objectives, or his motivations with the press or with the public. Government officials make clear to the media that discussing classified military information could result in criminal charges and imprisonment. The media, already intimidated by government power and by the threat of prosecution, begins to self-censor and to rely almost entirely on official government narratives rather than conducting independent investigation or seeking out alternative sources of information. Within a week, the story of Hummel's operation has been completely redefined in public discourse. Hummel is no longer a decorated general attempting to force government accountability. Hummel is now a rogue officer, a terrorist, a mentally unstable man who threatened American lives for personal reasons. The legitimate aspects of his grievance are completely erased from the public record. The families of fallen soldiers, rather than being portrayed as victims of government neglect, are portrayed as collateral damage in one man's mental breakdown. The system has successfully neutralized the threat posed by Hummel's operation by eliminating Hummel and then controlling the narrative about what Hummel represented and what he was trying to accomplish. Mason observes this process with the clarity of a man who has spent 30 years watching the system operate from the outside, from a prison cell, from a position of complete powerlessness. Mason understands exactly what is happening. Mason understands that the government is lying. Mason understands that the government is deliberately misrepresenting Hummel's motivations and his character. Mason understands that the government is protecting itself at the cost of historical truth and moral accuracy. But Mason also understands that he is powerless to stop this process. Mason is a freed prisoner who has no credibility with the public, no platform from which to speak, no way to challenge the official narrative. If Mason were to speak publicly about what actually happened on Alcatraz, about Hummel's legitimate grievances, about the government's willingness to firebomb an island to prevent accountability, Mason would likely be arrested for violating classified information agreements or for some other charge that the government could manufacture. Mason's freedom is conditional. Mason's freedom is a gift that can be revoked at any time. Mason knows this, and Mason knows that the price of maintaining his freedom is his silence. Goodspeed, meanwhile, is debriefed extensively by government officials who want to ensure that he will not become a whistleblower or a source of leaked information that could undermine the official narrative. Goodspeed is told, explicitly, that discussing classified aspects of the operation with anyone outside of government channels is a federal crime that could result in decades of imprisonment. Goodspeed is reminded of his security clearance obligations. Goodspeed is made to understand that the government has the power to destroy his career, his reputation, and his freedom if he decides to speak publicly about what he witnessed on Alcatraz. Like Mason, Goodspeed finds himself silenced by the threat of institutional punishment. Like Mason, Goodspeed is forced to watch the government lie about what happened and to remain silent about the truth. This is how the system protects itself. The system does not need to convince everyone of the official narrative. The system only needs to ensure that people who know the truth are silenced through fear, through threats, through the promise that speaking out will result in catastrophic personal consequences. The system is remarkably efficient at this process. The system has had centuries of practice at suppressing dissent and controlling narratives and ensuring that institutional authority is never seriously challenged by people who possess knowledge of institutional failures. The families of Hummel's fallen soldiers, the very people that Hummel was attempting to help, never receive compensation or acknowledgement from the government. In fact, the government quietly denies several pending claims for compensation and benefits that had been submitted by families of soldiers who died in the same covert operations that Hummel referenced in his demands. The government uses Hummel's operation as justification for tightening security clearances and restricting information about Black Ops missions. The government uses Hummel's operation as justification for limiting soldiers' ability to file complaints about compensation and benefits. The government uses Hummel's operation as justification for increasing surveillance of military personnel who might be considered at risk for psychological instability. The system has taken a challenge to its authority and has used that challenge to consolidate power and to restrict the freedoms and options available to soldiers and veterans. The system has not been reformed by Hummel's operation. The system has been strengthened. The system has used the crisis to implement policies that make future challenges to institutional authority less likely to succeed. The system is self-correcting in this way. The system learns from threats and adapts to neutralize those threats more effectively in the future. The film's resolution arrives not with triumph or catharsis, but with ambiguity and moral uncertainty that refuses to provide the audience with easy comfort or simple answers about what actually happened or what it means. Mason stands alone on the deck of a Navy vessel, standing in open air for the first time in 30 years, looking out at the San Francisco skyline that he helped save from destruction through his choice to help Goodspeed disarm the first missile. The ocean stretches out before him, infinite and indifferent to his suffering and his sacrifice. The city gleams in the distance, unaware that it came within moments of being destroyed, unaware that 70,000 people nearly died because a patriot decided that institutional betrayal had become intolerable. Mason is free now, technically and legally free, no longer imprisoned in a cell, no longer confined to a 6-by-8-foot space. But Mason is not truly free. Mason is haunted by the knowledge that Hummel is dead, that Hummel's attempt to force accountability has failed, that the system he helped protect through his actions remains fundamentally unchanged and unrepentant. Mason is free from prison, but imprisoned by the knowledge of systemic injustice that he can do nothing to address. Mason is free, but silenced. Mason is free, but powerless. The resolution offers Mason freedom as a gift from the system, but freedom purchased at the cost of his silence. Freedom conditional upon his acceptance of official narratives. Freedom that comes with the implicit understanding that speaking truth would result in his freedom being revoked. This is the film's statement about what freedom actually means in a system designed to protect institutional authority at any cost. Goodspeed, in the aftermath of the operation, is reinstated in his laboratory position and is assigned to work on new chemical weapons research projects designed to make American weapons more sophisticated and more devastating than ever before. Goodspeed has witnessed the horror of what chemical weapons can do, has understood the moral implications of working with tools of mass destruction, has confronted the reality that the government he works for is willing to use threats of mass destruction to protect its own interests. And yet Goodspeed is assigned to make those weapons better, more efficient, more lethal. The film is suggesting that the system is remarkable in its ability to absorb criticism and to continue functioning exactly as it always has. Goodspeed's moral transformation means nothing to the institution. The institution does not care that Goodspeed now understands its failures and its injustices. The institution simply redeploys Goodspeed to continue serving institutional interests, continues to extract his labor and his expertise in service of the same objectives he now questions. This is how institutions maintain power. They do not need to convince everyone that they are righteous. They only need to ensure that people with knowledge and capability continue to work within institutional structures, continue to serve institutional interests, continue to contribute to institutional power, even as those same people understand the immorality of what they are doing. Goodspeed will spend the rest of his career building weapons he questions, serving a government he no longer trusts, because the alternative is unemployment, social marginalization, and the consequences of resisting institutional demands. Goodspeed is trapped by his expertise. Goodspeed is trapped by his need for employment and security. Goodspeed is trapped by the system's ability to make resistance seem impossible and futile. The film's interpretation of what actually happened on Alcatraz is fundamentally different from the official government interpretation, and that difference reveals everything about how institutions maintain power and how truth is systematized out of existence in favor of institutional narratives. The official interpretation is that Hummel was a mentally unstable terrorist who threatened American lives. The interpretation that the film itself presents is that Hummel was a patriot broken by a system that treated soldiers as disposable, a man who loved his country so desperately that he was willing to threaten it in order to force it to love him back, a soldier who understood that the government was never going to voluntarily acknowledge its debts and therefore felt forced to make those debts impossible to ignore. The film is arguing that Hummel was right about the system's failure. The film is arguing that soldiers do deserve compensation for their sacrifice. The film is arguing that the government's unwillingness to acknowledge this debt is not a policy disagreement, but a fundamental moral failure. The film is arguing that Hummel's response, while extreme and while resulting in the threat to innocent lives, was a rational response to institutional injustice. The film is not arguing that Hummel's methods were correct or justified. The film is arguing that we must understand the conditions that made those methods seem necessary and reasonable to a good man. The film is arguing that the system bears responsibility for creating Hummel, for breaking him, for pushing him to the point where threatening mass murder seemed like the only option available to force acknowledgement of legitimate grievance. The thematic heart of The Rock is the exploration of patriotism and what happens when patriotism becomes incompatible with loyalty to a system that no longer deserves that loyalty. Hummel begins as a patriot in the conventional sense, a man who believes in his country, who sacrifices for his country, who dedicates his life to serving his country's interests. But Hummel's patriotism is tested and eventually destroyed by the system's refusal to reciprocate that patriotism. The system asks soldiers to die for it. The system asks soldiers to kill for it. The system asks soldiers to sacrifice everything. But the system does not give back. The system does not honor sacrifice. The system does not compensate families. The system treats soldiers as tools to be used and discarded. And when Hummel finally concludes that his country no longer deserves his patriotism, when Hummel decides that the system is unjust and that forcing accountability is more important than maintaining loyalty to an unjust system, Hummel becomes a terrorist in the eyes of that system. But Hummel is a terrorist only because the system forced him to become one. Hummel is a terrorist only because the system left him no other option for expressing legitimate grievance and demanding legitimate accountability. The film is asking, at what point does a patriot stop being a patriot and become a revolutionary? At what point does loyalty to a system become complicity in systemic injustice? At what point does the system itself become the enemy that patriots should resist? These are the questions the film poses without providing easy answers. The film suggests that Hummel asked these questions and concluded that the system had become an enemy. The film suggests that Mason, watching watching this unfold, has come to the same conclusion. The film suggests that Goodspeed, having witnessed the system's willingness to firebomb an island, is beginning to ask these same questions. The film's ending does not provide closure or resolution in any conventional sense. The missiles are disarmed. The immediate threat is eliminated. The hostages are rescued. These are conventional resolutions to the action plot, but the moral plot remains completely unresolved. The system has not changed. The system has not acknowledged its debts. The system has not reformed. The system has simply eliminated the person who challenged it and has moved on. The system continues to operate exactly as it did before Hummel's operation. The system continues to sacrifice soldiers in covert operations. The system continues to deny compensation to families of the fallen. The system continues to treat soldiers as disposable resources. And the system will continue this cycle indefinitely until another Hummel arises. Another patriot is broken by institutional injustice. Another person decides that the system no longer deserves loyalty or obedience. The Rock is not a film about defeating terrorism. The Rock is a film about how systems create the conditions that produce terrorism and how those same systems are powerful enough to survive even dramatic challenges to their authority. The Rock is a film about the tragic inability of individuals, no matter how brave or capable or morally righteous, to change systems that are designed to perpetuate themselves. The Rock is a film that asks whether patriotism is possible in a system that no longer merits patriotic sacrifice. And the film's answer, delivered through Hummel's death and Mason's silenced freedom and Goodspeed's continued service to a system he no longer trusts, is profoundly pessimistic. The system survives. The system always survives. And individual acts of resistance, no matter how dramatic or how costly, cannot change that fundamental reality. The film's resolution arrives not with triumph or catharsis or any conventional sense of closure, but instead with ambiguity and profound moral uncertainty that deliberately refuses to provide the audience with easy comfort or simple answers about what actually happened on Alcatraz or what those events mean for the future of the system and the nation it serves. Mason stands completely alone on the deck of a Navy vessel, standing in genuine open air for the first time in 30 years of confinement, looking out at the vast expanse of ocean and at the San Francisco skyline that gleams in the distance. He has helped save that city from destruction through his choice to help Goodspeed disarm the first missile, through his decision to prioritize the lives of 70,000 innocent civilians over his commitment to Hummel's cause. The ocean stretches out before him, infinite and utterly indifferent to his personal suffering and to his sacrifice and to the moral weight of the choices he has been forced to make. The city gleams in the distance, completely unaware that it came within moments of being destroyed, unaware that 70,000 people nearly died because a patriot decided that institutional betrayal had become intolerable and unforgivable. Mason is free now, technically and legally free in the most basic sense, no longer imprisoned in a concrete cell, no longer confined to a 6-by-8-foot space where he has spent 30 years of his life. But Mason is not truly free in any meaningful psychological or moral sense. Mason is haunted by the knowledge that Hummel is dead, that Hummel's attempt to force institutional accountability has failed completely, that the system he helped protect through his actions and his choices remains fundamentally unchanged and completely unrepentant about its failures. Mason is free from prison, but imprisoned by the accumulated knowledge of systemic injustice that he can do absolutely nothing to address or change. Mason is free but silenced by threats and by security agreements. Mason is free but powerless to speak truth or to demand accountability. The resolution offers Mason freedom as a gift from the system that imprisoned him, but freedom purchased explicitly at the cost of his silence. Freedom conditional upon his acceptance of official government narratives and official government versions of events. Mason's freedom comes with the implicit understanding that speaking truth about what actually happened, speaking about Hummel's legitimate grievances, speaking about the government's willingness to firebomb an island, would result in his freedom being revoked and his return to imprisonment. This is the film's statement about what freedom actually means in a system designed to protect institutional authority at any cost. Freedom in this system is not the absence of imprisonment. Freedom in this system is simply the privilege of choosing which of the system's demands you will comply with while maintaining the illusion of choice and autonomy. Freedom in this system is the right to be complicit in injustice without being forced to acknowledge that complicity. Mason's freedom is a cage of a different shape and size, but it is a cage nonetheless. Goodspeed, in the immediate and longer-term aftermath of the Alcatraz operation, is quietly reinstated in his laboratory position and is systematically assigned to work on new and advanced chemical weapons research projects designed to make America American weapons systems more sophisticated, more devastatingly effective, and more difficult for other nations to defend against. Goodspeed has witnessed firsthand the horror of what chemical weapons can actually do, has understood at a visceral level the moral implications of working with tools of mass destruction, has confronted the stark reality that the government he works for is willing to use threats of mass destruction to protect its own institutional interests and authority. And yet Goodspeed is assigned to make those same weapons better and more lethal. The film is suggesting through this assignment that the system is remarkable in its ability to absorb moral criticism, absorb individual transformation, and continue functioning exactly as it always has, regardless of whether individuals within the system have experienced moral awakening or have come to understand the system's failures. Goodspeed's moral transformation is gained understanding of the system's injustice, means nothing whatsoever to the institution that employs him. The institution does not care that Goodspeed now understands its failures and its injustices with complete clarity. The institution simply redeploys Goodspeed to continue serving institutional interests, continues to extract his labor and his technical expertise in service of the same objectives he now questions and doubts. This is how institutions maintain power across time. Institutions do not need to convince everyone that their actions are righteous or justified. Institutions only need to ensure that people with valuable knowledge and capability continue to work within institutional structures, continue to contribute to institutional power, even as those same people understand the immorality and injustice of what they are doing. Goodspeed will spend the rest of his career building chemical weapons he questions, serving a government he no longer trusts, implementing policies he no longer believes in, because the realistic alternative is unemployment, social marginalization, and serious personal consequences if he chooses to resist institutional demands. Goodspeed is trapped by his expertise. Goodspeed is trapped by his need for employment and economic security. Goodspeed is trapped by the system's power to make resistance seem impossible and futile. The system does not need Goodspeed to be happy or fulfilled or morally satisfied with his work. The system only needs Goodspeed to continue performing his technical functions and contributing to institutional objectives. The system's ability to compel compliance without requiring genuine belief or commitment is one of the most powerful aspects of institutional control. The system can have employees who actively distrust and question it, employees who understand its failures and injustices, and the system still functions perfectly because those employees have no choice but to continue working within it or face the consequences of resistance and refusal. The film's interpretation of what happened on Alcatraz is fundamentally and irreconcilably different from the official government interpretation being propagated through media and official channels. And that difference reveals everything about how institutions maintain power and how historical truth is systematically erased and replaced with institutional narratives designed to protect institutional authority. The official government interpretation is that Hummel was a mentally unstable and dangerous terrorist who threatened innocent American lives in pursuit of personal grievances. The interpretation that the film itself presents, through its narrative structure and through its sympathetic portrayal of Hummel's character and motivations, is that Hummel was a patriot broken by a system that treated soldiers as disposable resources to be used and discarded without acknowledgement or compensation. Hummel was a man who loved his country so desperately that he was willing to threaten it in order to force it to love him back, to force it to acknowledge the value of his sacrifice. Hummel was a soldier who understood with complete clarity that the government was never going to voluntarily acknowledge its debts to fallen soldiers and their families, and therefore felt forced to make those debts impossible to ignore through the threat of catastrophic violence. The film's final moments show us Hummel's body being transported off Alcatraz in a military body bag, transported with the same bureaucratic indifference that characterized his life of service. No ceremony, no acknowledgement of his decorated career, no recognition of his sacrifice or his attempt to force accountability. Just a body being processed, cataloged, and disposed of according to military protocol. The government will claim that Hummel died in a hostage crisis of his own making. The government will characterize his death as a tragic consequence of his own actions. The government will ensure that Hummel's name becomes synonymous with terrorism rather than with patriotism or justice. The film shows us the hostages being debriefed by FBI agents who make clear that discussing the specifics of Hummel's operation, his motivations, or his stated objectives is a matter of national security and could result in criminal prosecution. The hostages are offered money to sign non-disclosure agreements. The hostages are intimidated into silence. The hostages are transformed from witnesses to the operation into silenced observers who cannot speak about what they witnessed without facing serious legal consequences. This is how the system controls narrative. The system does not need to convince everyone of official falsehoods. The system only needs to ensure that people who know the truth are prevented from speaking about it. The system uses law and threat and intimidation to enforce silence. The system transforms knowledge into criminal liability. The system makes speaking truth an act of rebellion against institutional authority. And in doing so, the system ensures that official narratives become the only narratives that can be publicly discussed or widely believed without risk of personal consequence and institutional punishment. Goodspeed receives a commendation from the Pentagon for his work disarming the missiles and preventing catastrophe. Goodspeed is praised as a hero. Goodspeed is celebrated as a man who risked his life to protect innocent civilians. The irony is profound and devastating. Goodspeed is being celebrated for preventing the very catastrophe that the government itself was planning to create through the firebombing of Alcatraz. Goodspeed is being celebrated for saving lives while the government was preparing to take those lives in order to prevent any possibility that Hummel's message would reach the public. Goodspeed's commendation is itself a form of institutional control. The government is ensuring that Goodspeed's heroic status depends entirely on the official narrative. Goodspeed's reputation is now tied to the government's version of events. Goodspeed's credibility as a hero is conditional upon his acceptance of official narratives and his refusal to challenge those narratives with alternative accounts of what actually happened. Goodspeed's commendation is a collar that ties him to the institution and makes it nearly impossible for him to ever speak against the institution without destroying his own reputation and credibility. The system is extraordinarily effective at this. The system gives people rewards and recognition conditional upon their silence and their acceptance of institutional narratives. The system makes it nearly impossible for people to enjoy the benefits of institutional favor while simultaneously speaking truth that contradicts institutional interests. Mason is released from all military and federal custody with no charges filed and no official acknowledgement of the injustice of his 30-year imprisonment. Mason receives no compensation for lost time. Mason receives no formal apology. Mason receives no recognition that his imprisonment was unjust or unnecessary. Mason simply receives his freedom, conditional and temporary, and always subject to revocation if he violates the terms of his release. Mason walks out of a military facility and into civilian life with no money, no job prospects, no social safety net. Mason has no way to explain the 30-year gap in his resume without discussing classified operations. Mason has no way to establish credibility with potential employers because his entire history is classified and cannot be discussed. Mason is free in the legal sense. Mason is not free in any practical or meaningful sense. The system has given Mason the minimum possible gift, release from imprisonment, while ensuring that Mason's life will remain constrained and limited by the consequences of his past and by the system's ability to revoke his freedom at any moment if he becomes a problem or a threat to institutional authority. This is the film's statement about the limits of individual freedom in systems designed to protect institutional power. Freedom in such systems is always partial and always provisional. Freedom is always conditional upon compliance. Freedom is always contingent upon the system's assessment of your usefulness and your threat level to institutional interests. The thematic heart of The Rock revolves around the exploration of patriotism and what happens when patriotism becomes fundamentally incompatible with loyalty to a system that no longer deserves that loyalty and no longer reciprocates the sacrifice that patriotism demands. Hummel begins as a patriot in the conventional sense, a man who believes in his country, who sacrifices everything for his country, who dedicates his entire life to serving his nation's interests and his nation's strategic objectives. But Hummel's patriotism is tested by years of institutional indifference and is eventually destroyed completely by the system's refusal to reciprocate his patriotism in any meaningful way. The system asks soldiers to die for it. The system asks soldiers to kill for it. The system asks soldiers to sacrifice their lives, their families, their futures, everything. But the system does not give back. The system does not honor sacrifice. The system does not compensate families of the fallen. The system treats soldiers as tools to be used and then discarded when they are no longer useful or when their usefulness ends in death. And when Hummel finally concludes that his country no longer deserves his patriotism, when Hummel decides that the system is unjust and that forcing accountability is more important than maintaining loyalty to an unjust system, Hummel becomes classified as a terrorist in the eyes of that system. But Hummel is a terrorist only because the system forced him to become one. Hummel is a terrorist only because the system left him no other option for expressing legitimate grievance and demanding legitimate accountability. The system created Hummel. The system broke Hummel. The system then eliminated Hummel and blamed Hummel for the destruction that resulted from the system's own failures and the system's own betrayals. The film's ending is deliberately unresolved and deliberately pessimistic about the possibility of institutional change or individual redemption within systems designed to perpetuate their own power. The missiles are disarmed. The immediate threat is eliminated. The hostages are rescued. These represent conventional resolutions to the action plot of the film. But the moral and thematic plot remains completely unresolved and unsalvageable. The system has not changed. The system has not acknowledged its debts. The system has not reformed or improved or become more just. The system has simply eliminated the person who challenged it and has moved on to continue operating exactly as it did before Hummel's operation ever occurred. The system continues to sacrifice soldiers in covert operations. The system continues to deny compensation to families of fallen soldiers. The system continues to treat soldiers as disposable resources. And the system will continue this cycle indefinitely, generation after generation, until another Hummel arises, until another patriot is broken by institutional injustice, until another person decides that the system no longer deserves loyalty or obedience. The Rock is not fundamentally a film about defeating terrorism or preventing catastrophe. The Rock is a film about how systems create the exact conditions that produce terrorism and how those same systems are powerful enough to survive even dramatic and well-intentioned challenges to their authority. The Rock is a film about the tragic and devastating inability of individuals, no matter how brave or capable or morally righteous, to change systems that are architecturally designed to perpetuate themselves across time. The Rock is a film that asks the essential question, whether patriotism is actually possible in a system that no longer merits patriotic sacrifice. And the film's answer, delivered through Hummel's death and Mason's silenced freedom and Goodspeed's continued service to a system he no longer trusts, is profoundly and deliberately pessimistic. The system survives. The system always survives. Individual acts of resistance, no matter how dramatic or how costly, cannot change that fundamental reality of institutional power. The system is stronger than individuals. The system is more resilient than resistance. The system will adapt, will survive, will continue. And the soldiers will continue to die, and the families will continue to suffer, and the government will continue to deny compensation, and nothing will change. The film's final moments show us Hummel's body being transported off Alcatraz Island in a military body bag, transported with the same bureaucratic indifference and institutional coldness that characterized his entire life of service to a country that never truly valued or appreciated what he sacrificed. No ceremony honors his service. No acknowledgement recognizes his decorated career spanning 3 decades. No recognition of his attempt to force the government to acknowledge its moral debt to fallen soldiers and their families. Just a body being processed according to military protocol, cataloged like military equipment, and disposed of according to institutional procedures that view human remains as logistical problems requiring efficient solutions. The government will claim that Hummel died in a hostage crisis of his own making, that his death was a tragic consequence of his own actions and his own moral breakdown. The government will characterize his entire operation as the product of mental illness and grief rather than as a rational response to institutional injustice. The government will ensure through its control of official narratives that Hummel's name becomes synonymous with terrorism rather than with patriotism or with justice or with legitimate grievance. The government's narrative control is so complete that within weeks, most Americans will have completely forgotten Hummel's actual motivations and will remember only that a rogue general threatened their city. The film shows us the hostages being debriefed extensively by FBI agents who make abundantly clear that discussing the specifics of Hummel's operation, his actual motivations, his stated objectives, or his legitimate grievances is classified information protected by national security law and could result in serious criminal prosecution and imprisonment. The hostages are offered money to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements that prevent them from ever discussing what they witnessed on Alcatraz. The hostages are intimidated through explicit and implicit threats about the consequences of speaking to journalists or to the public. The hostages are transformed from witnesses to the operation into silenced observers who cannot speak about what they witnessed without facing serious legal consequences and institutional punishment. This is precisely how the system controls narrative and controls public understanding of events. The system does not need to convince everyone of its official falsehoods. The system only needs to ensure that people who know the truth, people who witnessed the truth, people who could credibly challenge official narratives, are prevented from speaking speaking about it through legal threats and through the power of institutional punishment. The system uses law as a weapon against truth. The system uses national security classifications as a mechanism for suppressing truth. The system makes speaking truth an act of rebellion against institutional authority. The system makes the dissemination of truth a criminal offense. And in doing so, the system ensures that official narratives become the only narratives that can be publicly discussed without risk of personal consequence and institutional punishment. The system ensures that truth becomes illegal while lies become official policy. Goodspeed receives a formal commendation from the Pentagon for his work disarming the missiles and preventing the catastrophe that would have resulted from the first VX missile reaching its target over San Francisco. Goodspeed is praised as a hero in official statements. Goodspeed is celebrated in the media as a man who risked his life to protect innocent civilians. Goodspeed's photograph is released to news agencies, showing him receiving a medal from a high-ranking military official. The irony embedded in this celebration is profound and devastating and deeply meaningful to the film's overall message. Goodspeed is being celebrated for preventing the very catastrophe that the government itself was planning to create through the firebombing of Alcatraz Island with thermite plasma. Goodspeed is being celebrated for saving lives while the government was simultaneously preparing to take those lives in order to prevent any possibility that Hummel's message would reach the public and inspire accountability. Goodspeed's commendation from the Pentagon is itself a sophisticated form of institutional control and institutional capture. The government is ensuring that Goodspeed's heroic status depends entirely and completely on the official narrative about what happened on Alcatraz. Goodspeed's reputation is now permanently tied to the government's version of events. Goodspeed's credibility as a hero is conditional upon his acceptance of official narratives and upon his refusal to challenge those narratives with alternative accounts of what actually happened and why it happened. Goodspeed's commendation is a collar that ties him to the institution and makes it nearly impossible for him to ever speak against the institution without destroying his own reputation and credibility and heroic status. The system is extraordinarily effective and sophisticated in this strategy. The system gives people rewards and recognition conditional upon their silence and their acceptance of institutional narratives. The system makes it nearly impossible for people to enjoy the benefits of institutional favor, to maintain their social standing and professional reputation, while simultaneously speaking truth that contradicts institutional interests. The system has rewarded Goodspeed in ways that ensure his continued silence. The system has made Goodspeed complicit in its lies by making those lies the foundation of his public reputation and his professional standing. Goodspeed cannot now speak truth without destroying everything the system has given him. The system has therefore purchased Goodspeed's silence through the mechanism of public honor and recognition. The system is so powerful that it does not need to imprison people to silence them. The system can simply reward them for lying and ensure that speaking truth would result in the loss of those rewards. Mason is released from all military and federal custody with no criminal charges filed against him and with no official acknowledgement of the profound injustice of his 30-year imprisonment. Mason receives no compensation for the decades of lost time, lost opportunity, lost life. Mason receives no formal apology from the government that imprisoned him. Mason receives no recognition that his imprisonment was unjust or unnecessary or morally indefensible. Mason simply receives his freedom, conditional and temporary, and always subject to revocation if he violates the terms of his release or if he becomes a problem or a liability to institutional interests. Mason walks out of a military facility and into civilian life with no financial resources, no job prospects, no social safety net to sustain him. Mason has no way to explain the 30-year gap in his personal history without discussing classified operations that he is legally forbidden to discuss. Mason has no way to establish credibility with potential employers because his entire professional history is classified and cannot be discussed with civilian employers. Mason is free in the most narrow legal sense. Mason is not free in any practical or meaningful sense. The system has given Mason the minimum possible gift, release from physical imprisonment, while ensuring that Mason's life will remain constrained and limited by the consequences of his past and by the system's permanent ability to revoke his freedom at any moment if he becomes a threat. The film's statement about freedom in institutional systems is clear and unambiguous. Freedom in such systems is always partial, always provisional, always conditional. Freedom is always contingent upon compliance with institutional demands. Freedom is always dependent upon the system's assessment of your usefulness and your threat level to institutional interests. Freedom can be revoked. Freedom freedom can be violated. Freedom is never actual autonomy. Freedom is simply a different form of control. The system has learned that it can control people more effectively through the granting of conditional freedom than it can through the application of absolute imprisonment. The system has learned that people will comply with institutional demands more readily if they are given the illusion of freedom. The system has given Mason this illusion. Mason is technically free. Mason will spend his freedom in silence, knowing that speaking truth would destroy his newfound freedom and return him to imprisonment. Mason will live as a free man imprisoned by the knowledge of systemic injustice that he cannot address. Mason will exist as a living contradiction, free but silenced, alive but powerless, released but still controlled.